Well, hello, good evening. Welcome, everyone, to the Knights of Last Call. My name is Derek Melinda, and I am happy to have you all here joining me tonight as we are going to spend the evening discussing the fighter. The fighter's really good. In Pathfinder 2, it's probably the strongest it's ever been. Good night, everybody. No, okay. I guess there's more to talk about, and we'll get into some of the details and history of the fighter tonight. We'll talk about how the fighter evolved over the last, say, 5 or 6 editions of Dungeons & Dragons, including Pathfinder 1 and into Pathfinder 2nd edition, where we will then spend the rest of our time discussing certain characteristics about the Pathfinder 2 class. We'll talk about some of the elegant decisions and some of the problems with the fighter class, and we'll also talk philosophically about how we feel about the fighter class and where its role is in the game, and some of the issues concerning it, or some of the concerns concerning it, is I suppose I would rather say. And you might be wondering, why are we talking about the fighter? And the answer is because you, the audience, voted for it. That's right. Last time we streamed, we had a tip goal, which the audience reached, and we had a poll right here in this YouTube for those of you who managed to join us live. A good reason to join live. And it was a kind of a close competition, but ultimately I thought for sure Thaumaturge was going to win, but fighter ended up being the winner. So here we are tonight talking about the fighter. The general consensus being, let's just get it out of the way. Which, to be fair, okay, that's fair. So yeah, very excited about that. Quickly, I want to give a shout out to -411 and to Ryan Blue Thunder, who over the weekend renewed their adventure membership, 411 for 3 months, and Ryan Blue Thunder for a 9 months streak. So thank you to everybody who supports us, and of course, and a big shout out, incredible thank you to all of our adventurers, as well as to all of our patrons who support us over at patreon.com/Knights of Last Call. We had our 100th sort of celebration stream last Thursday. We had some incredible support come out from all corners of the Knights universe, the Knight Nation. And, it was really, really humbling, and it's going to be really awesome and fun to get in there and talk about more games, play more games, and, with my friends and with you, my new friends. So it's going to be really, really, I think, it's going to be a very rewarding experience. Let's see. Lastly, before we get into the weeds of it, I can say that Northern Reaches Season 2, which is the Knights of Last Call's community mega Pathfinder 2 game, officially launched this last weekend. We run it in a series of weeks. It's real time. It's live, sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Immersive world where the actions of the players shape from week to week what is going on. We have a team of GMs who are building adventures. There's a lot of additional rules for leveling up your character. It's a little bit like an MMO and a West Marches campaign, but playing as if you're in a Pathfinder 2 campaign where there's no raid that you can just go do. Everyone gets to go do the raid. If you go and kill a dragon, that dragon is dead. If you make a significant change to the world, when we started last year, there was no guns and gears. The players took it upon themselves to take the necessary quests to unlock guns and gears. Anyways, we launched this with this weekend, Sunday, Eastern Standard Time, midnight, and we actually had one of our GMs schedule and run a huge game at midnight. So literally from the moment that it was able to go live, we have had games running nonstop. I think we had 3 or 4 games running just today. And more GMs are coming on board all the time. So, if you really want to get into the deep weeds of Pathfinder 2 and kind of see how the Knights of Last Call do it, I recommend that you come and check us out. That is a part of your Patreon benefit if you are a champion tier member. That's $10 a month. And for that, not only do you get all the other benefits of our Patreon, but you also get access to Northern Reaches. Anyways, I wanted to say that because last week it wasn't officially launched yet, and I didn't really want to say anything. We talked about it a little bit, but it is officially launched now. So we've got people in there playing and changing and shaping the world. It's going to be pretty awesome. All right. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them in the chat. I'll try to get to them. If you would like to show your support for the channel and want to make sure that your question gets read out to the chat and gets highlighted, feel free to drop a super chat or head to our Stream Elements tip. There's a link for that in the doobly-doo down below, or you can type !tip. Tonight we have two goals. First is our $75 super chat goal, which is to keep those Pathfinder 2 class streams going. So far, you all have shown an incredible amount of support for this kind of content. And as long as you all keep showing up and tipping, I am inclined to keep talking about Pathfinder 2 classes. Secondly, we have our Stream Elements tip goal, which is a behind the scene stream of my upcoming group who are going to be playing Root, learning Root. This is different from a session 0, but I was going to get my group of people together to kind of actually walk them through the mechanics, teach them Root. And I thought we would probably do a little bit of a stream with you all, sort of make sure that everyone knows how Root game works so that when you join and watch our actual play, you kind of follow along. But I thought it might be fun to actually turn the cameras on while I was teaching, the people what to do. Well, thanks, John. John comes in and demolishes it. Next goal. I don't know, John. Fate game at Origins, I guess. Thank you very, very much, John. It looks like we are going to keep those Pathfinder 2 classes coming. Thank you, John, for that incredibly generous and amazing tip here so early in the stream. I am strong. This is for you, buddy. Strong. Cheers. Strong. John, if you tell me what the next goal is, John. You tell me, and we'll set that up. Thank you very, very much. That is incredibly generous and supportive of you. All right, well, John is our clear hype boss and tip leader. Thank you, John. That is very, very nice of you. Yeah. In fact, John, go ahead and drop it in chat. You tell me what Pathfinder 2 class you want to see next. That's the class that we'll do next. All right, let us head over to the PDF screen. All right, so here we have it. The humble fighter from Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And of course, the fighter has been with us since the very beginning of the game. But this is our version for Pathfinder 2 that we're all so aware of.
Henry tipped $25. Bring on the Root.
Henry, $25, showing some support for Root. Henry, we are super excited to be getting a chance, not only to play Root. Thank you. Look at that. Coffee just dropped off. Not only are we excited to get a chance to play Root, we're really excited to get to bring you all, games again. The last time that we had played our actual play games was at the end of last year with Quest for the Frozen Flame. And I know a lot of people have really wanted to see the Knights play not only something that, was not just D20, but also something that kind of more emergent, more sandboxy. Again, we're not a professional group of actors who may or may not have scripts. So you're going to kind of get to see the good and the bad of that kind of gameplay, which is to say, it's a story. It's uniquely your story. But guess what? Sometimes the story could be a little bit cringy or bad. But hey, that's what it's all about, right? Hey, look at that. We just had ourselves Whoopelstein. Whoopelstein just became an adventurer. They are strong. Whoopelstein, welcome to the adventure. Enjoy your exclusive Knights of Last Call emojis, as well as your loyalty badge, my good sir. Thank you, Whoopelstein, a new hero to our Knights of Last Call Patreon. Thank you so much for your support and appreciate it. Love to see it. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing what you get into. There you go. Now, of course, Wolfenstein, we'll have to change these. I mean, some of these emojis are from our Quest for the Frozen Flames days. We're gonna have to update them for Root. I'm definitely working on putting in some cats and birds and mice, so that we can have funny things for that. We'll probably have a Patreon poll where we ask people about that and kind of decide what the emoji. Most of the time, the emojis are really for the actual plays, and we love to kind of update them every time we start a new actual play. So that's going to be a lot of fun for us. All right, so yes, like this is a classic one. I think that came out of the. I think this came out of Spells. Did this come out? Did the Jason Bullman wearing a wizard hat come out of All Spells Ranked? I think it did. Can we keep the Burning Mammoth? I mean, Burning Mammoth has become almost like a meme unto the Knights of Last Call itself. So like we use that one all the time in the actual Discord itself. So the fighter. Well, before we talk about the fighter for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we have been sort of taking it upon ourselves to talk about the history of these games and where these classes come from that we play today. Now, luckily for us today, the fighter is a fairly short journey, if you will, through the history of Dungeons and Dragons. And as we have so many times before, we start here with Dungeons and Dragons, the original pamphlet created in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Rules for fantastic medieval war game campaigns, playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. And if you'll indulge me, I understand that not everyone is completely aware of this. We're not going to get too deep into the weeds on it today, but I think it's important to understand how it is that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson came to create Dungeons and Dragons, because at the end of the day, the story of the fighter is kind of, inexplicably tied or intricately tied to this idea of Dungeons and Dragons being a fantastic medieval war game, right? Why do we call a D&D campaign a campaign? Well, the answer is because it's based off of a military campaign, right? And so to understand that, we need to kind of look back a little bit further and understand chainmail. So chainmail is a game. Gary Gygax and his group of players back in the 1960s were playing miniature war games. I'm talking painted little lead miniatures, playing Napoleonics, playing Revolutionary War, playing Roman battles. Gary Gygax and his group started to focus more on the medieval miniatures, and Gary Gygax and his friend Jeff Perrin created a set of rules that they called Chainmail, which was strictly a war game. Now, inside this war game, we can see that there is, information about terrain and turn sequences and movement and a whole variety of things that you would expect to see from a war game. Rules for melee, rules for morale. In fact, if you're familiar with the earlier editions of the game, you certainly will see how these things made their way into Dungeons and Dragons. But what made Chainmail stand out in particular was this section here, the so-called fantasy supplement. Because this is the 1970s, early 1970s, Lord of the Rings is kind of becoming this more of a cultural phenomenon. People are aware of the stories of Fritz Lieber, Frod and the Grey Mouser. You have Robert E. Howard's Conan, right? So there's this idea of sword and sorcery, of magic, of fantastic creatures and monsters. And Gary Gygax and Dave Perrin created a series of rules in Chainmail to sort of do two things, which are really important for our story. The first thing that they did is they obviously added this rules for this fantastic supplement. And let's be clear here. The idea here was that you were going to be using these to, have a big mass combat, something like the Battle of Pelennor Fields or the Battle of Helm's Deep. And sure enough, that was very popular. But Gary Gygax and Dave Perrin also introduced in this Chainmail rules for man-to-man combat. And the idea of this of this man-to-man combat was that instead of using one figure to represent numerous men, a single figure represents a single man. Let me be clear about this. This line right here would change role-playing games, would change gaming forever. Prior to this, when you made a miniature and you put it onto the battlefield, it represented a dozen men or 100 men. If you had a unit, if you were playing Civil War, recreation, and it was 60,000 men versus 75,000 men, you didn't literally have 60,000 miniatures on your battlefield. Instead, you would have a lead soldier, and he represented maybe a unit or a squad or part of a unit. In the man-to-man combat rules in Chainmail, Gary Gygax and Dave Perrin created the rules for where this idea that what if we just use 1-to-1? What if we really shrunk down the scale so that we had one figure representing one person? And you can even see here that this suggestion is to use this system for small battles and castle sieges. The idea being that this was a much more intimate, instead of a wide-ranging battle, an entire, campaign. This was just a small battle, a skirmish, where you might use your soldiers, your toy soldiers, your miniature soldiers in a 1-to-1 basis. Cybersmith says, Fighter has arguably changed the most with regards to core mechanics, from followers to bonus feats to mark to increased proficiency to action search. Cybersmith, I don't know that you're wrong. I think, how about this? How about we say this? With the exception of 4th edition, which we'll talk about, the Fighter has maintained the same core identity, but what has changed is how the Fighter goes about making that reality manifest, right? Because as the rules change, the Fighter needs to change to make sure that they maintain that sort of superiority of combat, which is what we sort of come to associate them with. In any case, it's a little bit like the troop rules, Cybersmith, but in reverse, right? So in the troop rules, you had this idea that, you might have one miniature on the battleground, but or on your Pathfinder game, but it might represent multiple troops. It's kind of one big conglomerate unit, but that's the idea. So they created these rules for man-to-man combat for small battles and castle sieges. Now, take that with these fantasy supplements, and you mix the two together, and you start to begin to see what would become Dungeons and Dragons, right? Instead of running an entire army where each man or each toy soldier represented dozens of troops, it represents one troop. And so obviously this is all Gary Gygax, right? So where does Dave Arneson come in? Well, turns out Dave Arneson and his group, which were down in the Chicago area, took these rules for Chainmail. They took this fantasy supplement and they took these rules for man-to-man combat. And what they took with the Chainmail rules is they built Castle Blackmore, which was essentially a dungeon, literally a dungeon, not like dungeon the way we think about it today. Dave and his group created rules where these heroes of the army would go underneath Castle Blackmore and explore the literal dungeons of that castle for treasure, for monsters, using the fantasy supplement. And, Dave Arneson and his friends thought this was incredible and amazing. And he got a hold of Gary Gygax and said, hey, I've been playing your game, but I've been tweaking it a little bit and using it with this idea of like a dungeon. I want to come up and show it to you. And as soon as Gary said that, he said, Dave, we've got something here. We have got a new game. We have a new genre of games. And that is to say, role-playing games. But it very much has its roots in wargaming. And to be quite honest with you, you can still see that today. So it is no surprise then that from the very beginning of the game of Dungeons and Dragons, we had in the original D&D only a handful of classes. In fact, there were only 3 classes. There were fighting men, magic users, and clerics. And fighting men were essentially soldiers. They had the ability to fight and combat in the ways that the other two classes, the spell casting classes, could not do. And it's what's interesting about this to me is if you look at this, and this is, by the way, true of first edition D&D, which we'll get to here in a second. I think this is kind of important. Context is always important to this. I know these histories. Some people like these histories. Some people don't like these histories. Let me know in the comments if you're watching this video later if you like these histories. But it's something that's important to realize, and I think a lot of modern players miss this. They look at old characters from, and I'll be the first to admit this. Here, I'm going to jump ahead here real quick, actually, just to kind of highlight something here. I'm going to jump to AD&D second edition. Okay. This is AD&D second edition. And we have here the warrior, and which represents the fighter. And you'll note that the fighter, unlike any of the other classes, okay, what do they get? Well, they get more than one attack a round. They start off with one attack a round, but at level 7, they get 3 attacks every 2 rounds. Yes, that's right. And then at 13th level or higher, they get 2 attacks a round. Okay? Guess what? They don't get any other ability. They get no other ability. So if you were looking at the fighter in like Pathfinder 2 terms, or if you were looking at the fighter in sort of Dungeons and Dragons terms, the character sheet or the character class in the book would have 20 levels, have all the hit dice, and then when the field that says special abilities, features, there'd be nothing. Because remember, feats didn't even exist at this time. They certainly didn't exist in 1974 with our old school Dungeons and Dragons. So what is it then that made the fighter so interesting and powerful? Well, perhaps a better question is, what did people actually do in the game? And the answer is magic items. Magic items used to be far more important to the game because rather than choosing feats that would sort of define what cool special powers your character would have, what made your character cool were the magical armors and magical weapons and magical items that they had, right? Another way to think of this is in the original versions of D&D, I would say up till 3rd edition. So 0th edition, 1st edition, and 2nd edition, your character was more like Batman. Today, I would say your character is more like Superman, which is to say your character in original D&D was, up. I mean, don't get me wrong. They were a cut above the rest. But at the end of the day, they were still just a guy or still just a girl. They might have had a lot of money. They could afford and buy nice things. And what they really had was all sorts of fun gadgets and toys. And it's these fun gadgets and toys that allowed them to be as effective at adventuring as they were. So the more magical items your character had, right? And there was no magical item resonance limit. There was no, attunement limitations. The more magical items your character had, the cooler they were. You'd be playing D&D and you'd meet someone and say, oh yeah, my character can turn into a snake and I use that to sneak into an orc camp and rescue the princess. You're like, oh shit. And you're like, yeah, my character has a cloak that enables them to fly. I use that to sail over and, attack the evil witch queen. Very cool. Magical items are sort of what defined your character's coolness or weirdness. Magical items weren't really balanced. They weren't really part of the game's like core math, right? They were just what people wanted, right? When you went and adventuring in D&D in these days, it was kind of this interesting dichotomy because on one hand, you wanted gold, treasure, because that was going to give you experience points. But magical items are what made your character awesome and cool. So the game didn't quote unquote need feats because the idea was that magical items are really what made you stand out. The reason I bring this out, or the reason I bring all this up, is because going all the way back to 1974, even going really through 1st edition and 2nd edition D&D, the biggest advantage of the fighting man, nowadays we laugh this off, by the way. This is almost not even a consideration of balance. But in the original version of D&D, the fighting man was the only character that could use all armor and use all weapons. A fighting man could use a mace, a sword, a trident, a hammer. Okay? Well, what difference does that make? It makes all the difference in the world. Because at this time and at this place, there was no such thing as a character having a specialized weapon. There was no idea that your GM was going to provide you with, oh, my character likes to use the chained whip. So in the dungeon, there's going to be a chained whip for my character. No, there were no runes to transfer your weapons. If the group found some badass trident, guess what? Your fighter picked that bad boy up, spin it around, say, I guess I'm using a trident now. And I can. No matter what armor or weapon we find, I can use it. And this meant that the fighting man got to use all the cool magical items that you found in the adventure. Now, obviously, they could not use wands and scrolls and the like. Those were for the spellcasters. But when it came to weaponry, only the fighting man, the fighter, had access to use anything and everything. And that meant that the fighting man could essentially always have whatever the best item was that was available to the group. They could have the best armor, they could have the best weapons, and they'd have the coolest stuff because they were the only ones that could use it. So it's kind of an interesting, idea that we think that we have this idea now that the fighting man, nowadays we call that, in Pathfinder 2nd edition, what do we call that? We call that proficiency with all martial weapons, right? And now we hand that out like a dime a dozen. Hell, now the rogue gets that in the upcoming Pathfinder 2 remastered. Because nowadays, it's not a big deal that someone can use all the weapons. If you do, it's more of a flavor thing, really, than anything. But at this time, in this place, being able to use any armor or any weapon was actually a significant advantage. Now, of course, like we've seen in later editions, the fighting man would also, aka the fighter, would also have the highest hit points or hit dice. Here we go. There we go. The fighting man. As they advance their way up. By the way, some of the terms for fighting man as you gain levels, hero and superhero, were literally taken from chainmail. And that was the kind of representing sort of a, like an Aragorn character in your fantasy game, a hero and a superhero. And so the fighting man, as they gained experience and levels, you could see that they gained no spells, but they did gain more dice for accumulative hits, aka hit dice, aka more hit points. It might surprise you to learn, however, that at this time and in this place, the fighter gained D8 hit points per level, not D10. And actually, I just learned this the other day. There's a reason for that. They didn't make D10s yet. The only thing, the way you could do a D10 was to do a D20 numbered 1 through 10 on half of its side, and then the other half of its side label it 1 to 10. At the time, at this point in time and place, they did not make D10s. And so nothing really used D10s because there weren't D10s. You had D8s, you had D6s, you had D4s, D20s, D12s, but no D10s. Because they are not technically a platonic solid. So the fighting man, used D8 hit points and got the best armor and weapons. And that's all they got in basic D&D. Now, to be fair, you died at 0 hit points, so having a couple more hit points is probably not a bad thing, especially when you consider that someone like the magic user got D4. But essentially, their biggest advantage was that they could, use all the armor and weapons. By the way, kind of a fun little note here. We've talked about this before in prior streams, but if we look back here at how much experience points you need to, say, get to the next level, let's say level 2, you'll notice that the magic user requires 2,500 experience, the fighting man 2,000, and the adept 1,500. So even back then, they were kind of throwing a bone to clerics and being like, yeah, listen, your class, you get to level up quick, okay? Because you're going to be healing people a lot. To be clear, though, the cleric did have a significant advantage in the sense that back then they could use every armor. So they had at least that advantage going for them. You were quite right, George. The D20 was 0 to 9. Yes, just kind of like it is today. So 0 to 9 on two sides. Yes, you are absolutely right. Good point. Good point. Yes, exactly, Priest. Fighting man uses whatever weapons he can. Spin a trident, crack a sword, crack a whip, swing a sword. There we go. Anyways, so that is our fighting man, and in our kind of baseline of D&D. And to be honest with you, this really wouldn't change that much as we move into some of the later editions of Dungeons and Dragons. Here we are at first edition, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And we also get our fighting class. And now it is properly called the Fighter. And let's find our fighter here. Here we go. So here's our fighter. We can now see that the fighter has D10 hit points. D10, and that they can get up to 9 hit dice of hit points, and that they have no spell-like ability. And if we pull out our cleric here, our druids, here we go. We can see that the experience point table is still the same. It's still 2,000 experience points in order to gain a level. In fact, some of these level titles have remained the same. We've got the hero. It's at 4 now instead of 5. We still have the Myrmidon. We have the superhero, the lord. These are the level titles. And when we look at what the fighter gets, we can look. This is it. Look. See over here on the right. This is the paladin. Look what the paladin gets. Right. The paladin gets detect evil in 60-foot radius. Makes all saving throws with +2. Immune to all forms of disease. Ability to lay on hands, healing people once a day. Ability to cure disease. A continuous emanation of a protection from evil spell. That's at level 1. At level 3, they get the power to affect undead, devils, and demons as if they were a cleric, aka they could turn undead. At 4th level, they can call for a warhorse. You can eventually get a holy sword. You can eventually cast clerical spells. That's what a paladin gets. Here's what this is it. This is the thing for the fighter. That's it. Although fighters do not have magic spells to use, their armor and weapons can compensate. They have the most advantageous combat table and generally have good saving throws possibilities as well. Right? Fighters can employ many magical items, including potions, protection scrolls, many rings, a few wands, one rod, many magic items, and all forms of armor, shields, and weapons. And then when you get to 9th level, guess what? You get your own cool little keep. You can establish a freehold and become a lord of your domain or a lady of your domain, where you can collect a monthly revenue of 7 silver pieces from every inhabitant of your freehold due to trade, tariffs, and tactics. So the fighter was just a PC with a good amount of hit points, essentially a favorable attack table, aka a good bonus to hit, and they could use all armor and weapons. There's still nothing like feats. There's still nothing like special abilities. You are just a person who beats people down. And sometimes that's enough. In a game where, again, dying at 0 meant your character was, getting to 0 hit points meant your character was dead. It was enough that your character had the best armor and, generally speaking, had the most hit points. We would see that not much would change with 2nd edition. Cybersmith asks, what was the action cost to switch weapons back then? Well, that's a great question, Cybersmith, because back then, combat rounds were typically considered to be 1 minute long. And as a result, a lot of the minutia of tracking, compare with 3rd edition, right, where it became 6 seconds. A combat round was considered to be 1 minute. In fact, in this book, in 2nd edition Player's Handbook, there is a fantastic example. I might be wrong. It could be in the DMG, but I'm going to look for it. Here we go. I found it. That's crazy. So here we go. A round is approximately 1 minute long. And it says here, but these are just approximations. Precise time measurements are impossible to make in combat. An action that might be ridiculously easy under normal circumstances might be truly heroic when attempted in the middle of a chaotic furious battle. Imagine the simple act of imbibing a healing potion. First, a character decides to drink the potion before retiring for the night. All he has to do is get out of his backpack, uncork it, and drink the contents, no problem. Now imagine the same thing in the middle of a fight. The potion is safely stored in the character's backpack. First, he takes stock of the situation to see if anyone can get the potion out from him. But, not surprisingly, everyone is rather busy. So, sword in one hand, he shrugs off one strap of his pack off of his shoulder. Then, just as two orcs leap towards him, the other strap threatens to slip down, entangling his sword arm. Already, the loose strap keeps him from fully using his shield. Holding the shield as best as possible in front of him, he scrambles backwards to avoid the first wild swings. He gets pushed back a few more feet when a companion shoulders past to block their advance. His companion buys him a little time, so he kneels, lays down his sword, and slips the backpack all the way off. Hearing a wild cry, he instinctively swings his shield up just in time to ward off a glancing blow. Rummaging through his pack, he finally finds the potion, pulls it out, and huddling behind his shield, works the cork free. Just then, there is a flash of flame all around him. A fireball! He grits his teeth against the heat, shock, and the pain, and tries not to crush or spill the potion vial. Biting back the pain of flames, he is relieved to see that the potion is still intact. Quickly, he gulps it down, reclaims his sword, kicks his backpack out of the way, and runs up back to the front line. In game turns, the character withdrew, was missed by one attacker, made a successful saving throw versus a fireball, drank a potion, and was ready for combat the next round. So everything that I just described in that prior paragraph happened in one round. Right? So, there's a lot you could do. And you can see here, what can you do in one round? So there was a lot more that you could do. Than just, make one swing of your weapon. So anyways, second edition D&D wasn't that different than first edition D&D in terms of what our boy the fighter could do. What we will see is that the fighter does start to gain this idea of more attacks per round as they gain higher levels. And this idea of weapon specialization. So we start to see the very first beginnings of this edition of weapon specialization, which was a kind of special use of the rules in order to allow your warrior classes, that would be the paladin, the fighter, and the ranger, to get additional benefits to hit and damage with their special weapon. So for example, if a character specialized with a melee weapon, they get a +1 bonus to hit and +2 bonus to damage rolls with that weapon. I have to say this because I think it's really important. Even back in the 90s when I was playing second edition D&D, I hated this rule. And it might seem strange. Why would you hate this? It's because I hate weapon specialization for fighters. Because to me, the core genesis of our fighting man is this idea that they can use any weapon, which is great. Of course they can. They still can, right? But not as much. Because now if I get this specific bonus and it's only with long swords, then now my character is a longsword fighter. And if my character finds a cool mace or a cool warhammer or a cool axe, I'm going to be not inclined to wield it because that's not what my character specialized in. We take this even a step further with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where of course you can use runes to customize any weapon you want. But imagine some of the specialty weapons in Pathfinder 2 that aren't just runes that you can swap in and swap out. Now imagine that your character has a weapon group specialization. Their character is a higher level of proficiency with a different set of weapons than they are with this weapon, not to mention potentially combining with your feats, right? You might have a bunch of, your character might be designed around with feats using a one-handed weapon and a free hand. So when your character finds an incredibly awesome polearm in Pathfinder 2, you're not going to use it. You're not going to use it. So this is one of the reasons why at this point we start to see this idea of fighters going from this, I can pick up any weapon and I am a badass with it, to becoming a little bit more specialized, becoming a little bit more siloed. And I kind of don't like that as the game sort of evolved and changed. So that brings us to 3rd edition. And of course, in 3rd edition, we introduced the feat, which would forever change Dungeons and Dragons and would forever change our games. And is obviously a huge change to the way that we play Pathfinder 2 today. And in 3rd edition, everybody got feats, but you only got a feat every 3 levels. So that meant that your character only got 6 or 7 feats, depending if you were human or not, over the course of the entire game, which is, at the time, it seemed like an incredible amount. But of course, nowadays would seem like it's nothing at all. And so we've got our fighter. And of course, the fighter is still D10 hit points, is still going to be proficient with all weapons, all armor, all shields. There's Tordek, there's Redgar. So what did the fighter get? The fighter got bonus feats. The fighter's thing was that they got a lot more feats than any other class. No other class got bonus feats like this. The wizard, I think, got 4 bonus feats, which they could use to take meta magic, and they could use it to take item creation feats. But the fighter got a whopping 11 bonus feats. So a fighter would end up with 17 or 18 feats, and other characters would end up with 6. So this was a huge, huge change, because for the first time ever, you had these really cool special powers that they added to the game. And if you wanted them, they were really big fans of like feat chains in 3rd edition, where, you had to take one feat to take another feat, take another feat. You had to take another separate chain of feats just to qualify for one feat. The only class that really had a chance of doing that in any respectable amount of time was the fighter. Cybersmith with a super chat says, didn't earlier editions fighters get extra followers? Yeah, so great question. So if we go back here, this is 2nd edition, which still applies. We can see here that when your character gets to 9th level, aka your fighter becomes a lord, you can automatically attract men-at-arms. These soldiers, having heard of the fighter, come for the chance at fame, adventure, and cash, and they are loyal, as long as you have a land and a castle to take care of them. In addition, your 9th level fighter attracts an elite bodyguard, your household guards. Although they are still mercenaries, they have greater loyalty than returns than another one. So it's kind of like you get your own personal companions, and you actually can roll on this chart to determine what kind of followers you have. Now, that's pretty cool, but you know what? If you look, the Rangers got followers too. Not as many. I will grant you that. Only the fighter really became like a king and a lord. So I hesitate to say that you got bonus followers, because if we go, to the priest, the cleric can attract 20 to 200 of these followers as you build your new church and place of worship. But there was definitely a sort of martial bend, and only the fighter kind of got this really elaborate, table of rolling to determine, what were your elite units that you attracted. Oh, you attracted 10 first-level elven fighter mages with chainmail, longsword, longbow, and dagger. And you also picked up, 40 infantry with chainmail, heavy crossbow, and short swords, right? So you end up having this kind of cool, domain play. And again, when we think about domain play and we think about the fighter, look at these classes. I mean, in second edition, which is the same as 1st edition, notice this hit dice table here. Okay, this is how many D10s you roll, right? D10 plus con, just like we do today, your con modifier. So at level 1, you would roll 1 D10 plus your con modifier. That's how many hit points you got. And at level 2, you would roll another D10, add your con modifier, and now that's your maximum hit points. Note that once you get to level 9, you no longer add a hit die. You no longer add your constitution. You just add 3 hit points each level. So once you get to 9 hit dice, you're capped. There was this idea that around level 9 or 10, your character was kind of done being a adventurer. Your character was now a really wealthy, really powerful mover and shaker in the world. This is something I think that gets lost in sort of modern RPGs, where you're this insanely powerful character. I mean, unto a god almost, an army unto your character's self. I'm talking about level 13 or 14 or 15. And yet the world and the adventures that your character goes on, I don't feel like they do a good job of acknowledging that. So there was this idea, because again, coming out of, miniature wargaming, your campaign was that your character may have started off as just a simple soldier who went on adventure instead of joining the army. Maybe they used to be in the army, but they got drummed out for being insubordinate. And then they went and made their living being kind of a ne'er-do-well, sort of a vagabond, a merc, a murder hobo, perhaps. But now they have money and power and prestige, and they become this sort of political force in the game. And there was this idea that as you transition from the lower levels to the higher levels, your character went from being a kind of, murder hobo, scum of the earth, vagabond, vagrant, to this powerful lord and shaper of the world. And that's as a fighter. I mean, as a wizard, your character would become a master of the arcane arts and found a wizard college or tower. Your cleric would become a new demagogue that would sort of be, preaching the faith and taking it into the infidels and trying to smash the opposition to their church, right? So all of these things were sort of part of the game. And that's because, D&D, this edition, second edition, came out in 1989. At that point, it was still only 15, 16 years old. So everybody was still really tied into that idea of the war game and this progression. And what ended up happening is at some point in the late 80s into the 90s, especially in the 90s, when you had more of a focus on these White Wolf games, these storytelling games. I'm going to say something here, which is kind of controversial. A lot of people shit on 4th edition D&D because they say it was just, giving into the World of Warcraft and giving into the MMOs, and, they were trying to become a video game and they were trying to follow the zeitgeist of what people were doing. I argue that if you look at 2000's 3rd edition, which, by the way, is the closest.
$15.
Hey, Rick.
Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Yes, absolutely. Rick is quoting the very beginning of Conan the Barbarian, a movie which I would love. We want to do some movie night stuff up at the studio where me, Bob, and Aaron get together and watch movies, and me and Aaron basically shit on Bob for having terrible taste in movies or trying to explain to him awesome movies that he's never seen. And if not the first one, is going to be Conan the Barbarian. But yeah, so where was I going with this? Yes, people criticize 4th edition for sort of being video gamey, which it wasn't, but I could see where people make that connection. But I argue that 3rd edition D&D, which is really Pathfinder 1, which beget Pathfinder 2, was just as guilty of this, because in the 90s, we saw this renaissance in the storytelling system. That's your White Wolf. That's your Vampire the Masquerade. That's your Werewolf the Apocalypse. That's your Mage the Ascension, where, it became less about, wargaming and more about your characters, heroic or, gothic struggle and growth. And by the time we get to 3rd edition in 2000, that entire domain play, all right, where your character becomes the high priest of a temple or the lord of a freehold, has been removed from the game. There's a throwaway feat in 3rd edition's Dungeon Master Guide called Leadership, but it is not a part of the core context of the game anymore. And now your character, they're gaining D10 hit points all the way from level 1 all the way up to level 20. You're getting more feats, you're getting more hit points, right? I mean, an old character, an old fighter would have stopped essentially gaining hit points at 9th level. And now at 20th level, your character is going to have 20 D10 plus your constitution modifier times 20. That is going to be relatively an unbelievable amount of hit points. So the game really, really changes in 3rd edition with the introduction of these feats. And fighters start to lose a little bit of their mojo. Spell casting is now extremely powerful. It was always powerful back in the day. Don't get me wrong. Fireball was still really awesome and effective back in the day. But wizards were really, really frail and fragile. And remember, wizards required more experience to level up than, say, a fighter did. So wizards might not even be as high of level as the fighter or the thief. But now wizards and fighters are advancing at the same level as they were in prior editions. And now wizards are able to get magical items that improve their armor class. And now the wizard is still using the same spell. Fireball did D6 damage per level in 1st edition D&D. And it still does that much damage in 3rd edition. They didn't nerf any of these spells. If anything, they made them more powerful. I don't want to go off on another rant here, but in 1st edition and 2nd edition, your character got saving throws, and it's actually sick that I remember what page it's on. It's on page 101. That's just something I know from D&D 2nd edition Player's Handbook, is that the saving throw tables on page 101. One of the things that you can see here, this is interesting. This is 2nd edition D&D, but this is very, very close or similar to 1st edition D&D. So the way saving throws worked, by the way, is they weren't tied to an ability score like we think of today. Instead, you looked up your character's level. You could write these on your sheet. For those of you who don't know how this worked, you would write down, there were 5 types of categories: paralyzation, poison, and death magic. That was one. Rod, staff, or wand. That was the second one. Petrification or polymorph, breath weapon, and spell. If your character was affected by one of these and it allowed a saving throw, so for example, if a Medusa appeared and looked at you, your character was going to be turned to stone. That was like the given. But you had a chance to save yourself. It was really, truly saving yourself from death or destruction. And you can see here that these numbers are what your character needs to roll equal to or higher than on a D20 roll. So you can see that a rogue, for example, needs, at levels 1 through 4, only needs a 12 to beat petrification or polymorph, which is pretty good. On the other hand, a level 1 warrior, like our fighter, needs a 15. Right? That means you have a 30% chance of passing that save. But this is what's so important. It's almost like narrative plot protection was built into the game. Because notice, as your character gets higher level, say all the way up to level 9 or 10 or 11, look at how low these values get. You have an 80% chance or a 90% chance, or hell, a 95% chance to pass this save. But guess what? There was no such thing as a DC. That saving throw was 2, regardless of whether that effect came from a level 1 wizard or a level 99 wizard. You needed a 2. There was no modifiers to this. This meant that as your character got higher level, the chance that they would be, say, instantly killed by a death spell became much, much lower, because your high-level rogue only needs to roll a 5 or higher on a D20 in order to save versus that spell. So saving throws were sort of a form of narrative plot armor, because they got better as your character got higher level. It was sort of a way of saying, hey, you've put this much time and effort into your character, so when something happens, like you get turned to stone, you get disintegrated, you get instantly killed, you get breathed on by a dragon, your characters, they've been around the block. they are not going to get, they're not some, green-footed greenhorn newbie or rookie. They know how to get themselves out of messes, and their saving throws are going to be much better by comparison. When we hop back over to 3rd edition, wizards still had disintegrate and death spells, but now the DC was tied to the wizard's level, and someone like the fighter had a bad will save. Okay, so what ends up happening now is, whereas before a character like a thief or a character like a fighter would actually have a really great chance against a wizard spell, because at higher level, their saves were so good that they were like 80% plus to pass the save. Now, with the wizards stacking their DCs and the DCs going up, and a fighter maybe having a poor wisdom and a low will save, your character was couldn't possibly beat it. And so as a result of this, spellcasting was extremely broken in 3rd edition and in Pathfinder 1. And, our poor fighter kind of went from being sort of the, even with all these bonus feats, the fighter kind of became a sad character class, because, there was even a wizard spell called Tensor's Transformation, okay, that just turned your character into a fighter, your wizard. Let's find it here. I love that, like, there's some feats that reference it. There it is. Tensor's Transformation, level 6. 1 round per level, so this is going to last 11, 12, 13 combat rounds. Your base attack bonus equals your character level, which is what a fighter gets. You get proficiency in all weapons. Your strength, dex, con, natural armor all increase. Your character becomes a fighter. Keep in mind that when you don't want to be a fighter, you're still a wizard, and you can, fly and cast fireballs and turn invisible. But you know what? You could also just, when you want to, you could become a fighter. It's absolutely insane how powerful spellcasting was in 3rd edition. Blood Ernest says, if you squint, that 2nd edition saves table looks a lot like the PF2e progression spreadsheet that features in these class videos. That's kind of a funny. It's a little bit different though, because the math goes down pretty quickly. Exactly, Cybersmith. This is an example of what I talk about all the time with design with these RPGs, which is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or putting the horse before the cart, which is putting the cart before the horse, which is they change these rules, but they don't think about why those rules or mechanics were in the game to begin with. Wizards were very powerful, but they had very low hit points. They had almost no armor class. They needed more experience points to level up. And as characters got higher level, they essentially became more and more and more immune to the spells and magical abilities of
GM Scott
the fighter.
$25. Just joined. Not sure what's going on with the tip goals, but here's for the BTS stream.
Thank you, GM Scott. Yeah, so tonight's tip goals. Well, we started off with a super chat to keep the Pathfinder 2 classes coming, and John B came out and smashed it immediately with a $100 super chat. So that was a given right from the bet. John's got to decide what class we're doing next. That is his prerogative. The second goal is I was going to do a get together with Aaron and Bob, Nick, and our new person joined the show, Dirt, our buddy Dirt, who runs our local gaming store, to teach them how Root works. And I was thinking, not a session 0, but just like hey, this is how a PBTA game works. Nick and Dirt have never played Powered by the Apocalypse game ever before in their life. And so I thought, well, you know what, if we're going to be doing this, man, maybe we'll set a tip goal, and it'll be a little bit rough and rusty, but we can air it and we can have people kind of join in. And originally I was just going to teach everybody in a stream in a very controlled fashion, but we could do it like chaotic nonsense instead. So anyways, point is, the fighter changed a lot between 2nd edition and 3rd edition, and then would change even more with 4th edition. So without getting too much into the weeds of it, because it's already 8 o'clock, suffice to say that the fighter and the idea of the martial character has always been a little bit strange in Dungeons and Dragons, because your character, a fighter, was the character who was wielding a big sword or a big axe and was doing a lot of damage. And your character was also, wearing the heaviest armor and having the best shield. So it's like fighters got to be like the best combatants, but they also got to be the most defensive characters. And as we went into 4th edition, one of the precepts of 4th edition was, okay, your character class cannot do it all. And so what they had to make a decision for the fighter was, do we want the fighter to be that sort of defensive character who really protects his allies, or do we want the fighter to be sort of the aggressive damage dealing character? Well, turns out other classes kind of had more of a claim to the damage dealing part. The rogue, for example, the ranger, for example, kind of had that non-magical, using martial powers to do a bunch of damage. So fighter wasn't likely going to be a damage dealing, a striker. Instead, the fighter got the role of defender. Did I miss a Cybersmith super chat? Sorry. Oh, I did. Cybersmith, I apologize. So our modern idea of high-level adventures in AD&D terms would be like Rishi Sunak, Elon Musk, and the Pope teaming up to bust a local drug dealer. Exactly. That's exactly right. That is 100% correct. I mean, look at these high-level characters. Look at your character in Pathfinder 2. Like, your character, your magical items are worth hundreds of thousands of gold. You could build cities. You could have, multinational, even in a fantasy world, multinational armies and power, and like you spend it all to get a +3, belt of athletics. Who are you even buying this from? That is exactly right, Cybersmith. And again, it's just a little bit weird, It's just a little bit of a strange way to think about it. So the fighter then had this issue, which is the character was back in the day. The reason why you would want to attack a fighter is because the fighter did a lot of damage. They could attack multiple times around, right? And so they were a real threat on the battlefield. So if the enemy chose to engage the fighter, that made sense. The fighter was doing a lot of damage. Yeah, sure. Ideally, you'd want to kill your wizards first, but the fighter was no slouch. The fighter was doing a lot of damage. But they were really protected, and they had a lot of hit points. So it was this kind of cool tension or balance. But if you take away from fighters, or you really take away from any class, the ability to do damage, and you give them really high defenses, by the way, this is the problem with the champion class in Pathfinder 2nd edition. If a character isn't a battlefield threat, but they do have really, really high defenses, why would any enemy engage them? And I don't think this is being a metagame cheesy fuck. Okay? Most of the creatures that you play in the game have int 8 or higher, and any reasonably intelligent character is going to be able to have a basic grasp of battlefield strategy. I mean, even in the real world, like animals are able to, assess which, prey is weak or injured and separate and work to separate them from the pack, right? So any sort of moderately intelligent character is going to realize, hey, this fighter character in 4th edition is not a damage dealer. They have really high hit points and good armor. Why would I ever attack them? And the answer is you wouldn't, which is why in 4th edition, they introduced this idea of the combat challenge, okay? Which is also known as marking, which is a little bit like taunting from our modern day concepts of, computer RPGs. And the idea is that a fighter could mark an enemy by attacking them. Didn't even have to hit. All you had to do was try to hit an enemy. And if you hit that, and if you made an attack against that enemy, hit or miss, the character became marked. And that character that got marked would have a penalty to attack anyone else that wasn't you. In addition, the fighter got certain benefits against their marked opponents. Like, for example, whenever a marked enemy that is adjacent to you shifts, that's like a 5-foot step, or makes an attack that does not include you, you can make a melee basic attack against them as an immediate interrupt. So not only do you get your attack of opportunity if they move away, you even get an attack of opportunity if they shift, or if they step, or if they are standing next to you but attack your buddy, you get to attack them. Additionally, if an enemy does move away and you hit them with your opportunity attack, your attack of opportunity, they stop moving, right? This is just like the disruption ability on crit from attack of opportunity that the fighter gets in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, right? If you critically hit with the fighter's disruption ability, you can potentially stop people from moving. Maybe that's not the fighter, maybe that's the monk. But regardless, you only do that on a crit. But in 4th Edition, all a fighter had to do was hit with that opportunity attack. If a fighter hit with an attack of opportunity, the enemy could no longer move for the rest of the turn, right? And that meant that they were stuck next to the fighter. So the choice was do nothing or attack this fighter. I guess I'm going to attack this fighter. So what ended up happening here is that the fighter had the ability to control the battlefield and make themselves a defensive, asset to the party. A couple super chats came in. Cybersmith says, my main issue with 4E's mark is that it doesn't change the calculus for the fighter. If it were removed, I'd probably attack the enemy anyways 90% of the time. It's interesting for everyone but the user. There is a certain amount of truth to that. I agree with you, because it's not really something that the fighter gets benefit from either way. I will say, you can choose to mark the target. So sometimes the fighter might not mark a target. Maybe they don't want that much attention. Maybe they don't want that much heat. So there is a situation where they could, choose not to mark the target. But I would also say that really what it came down to is a fighter was oftentimes just looking for a lot of different ways to spread their mark around. There's a lot of abilities that the fighter gets that essentially allow them to do, attack multiple targets, or, attack one person, throw an axe at a different person. Now I've attacked 2 people. I've marked 2 people. In fact, one of our favorite things in the game was, in fact, actually you can see here that the example fighter that they give here is a Dragonborn. Well, a Dragonborn, the actual race in 4th edition, from the very start of the game, the Dragonborn in 4th edition started with this racial power, which is called Dragon Breath. And it's an encounter power, aka a focus spell. You could use it once every 5 minutes, or roughly once a fight. And it was only a minor action, by the way. So in Pathfinder 2nd Edition terms, this was only 1 action. You could still move and attack and do your Dragon Breath. And what it was like a close area cone, right? Like a burning hands. And you made an attack against all of the enemies in that area. But if you were a fighter and you were a Dragonborn and you breathed fire on 3 or 4 or 5 enemies, those count as attacks, which meant you were also marking those enemies. So it was really, really cool because a Dragonborn fighter could run up and literally mark, almost an entire battle. It was pretty sweet. I was a big fan of it. So the fighter in 4th edition was definitely, again, the fighter changed a lot from 2nd edition to 3rd edition in the sense that the fighter got these feats added to them, and all the other characters got way more strong, but the fighter stayed kind of the same. So it kind of sucked. In 4th edition, fighters got changed a huge amount again. They went from being damage dealers to being actually tanks, right? And sort of being defenders, not attacking characters, not being a damage dealer like they had been for so long. Now they could still use all sorts of items and armor, but John Smith. If your DM ignored your threats, a fighter was an absolute murder machine. I put Rangers to shame in a couple of games. John, are you talking about in 4th edition? I'm curious. John, why don't you tell me? I'm curious what what systems you're talking about. Yes, the chat is going really, really quick. Also, whenever I'm reading a PDF, it's always a little bit harder. Well, it's interesting, Matt, because one of the things that Aaron and I always liked about 4th edition, and we wish they had leaned into this a little bit more. Every class in 4th edition had 2 components, right? There's the role, which we know is defender, striker, leader, aka healer, buffer, and controller, aka AoE damage dealer, debuffer, okay? But there was also the power source, right? Martial, arcane, divine, primal. Aaron and I noticed that each of the power sources had a little bit of a sub role to it. And martial power sources all had a little bit of a striker role to it, which is to say that a fighter as a defender, well, the paladin was also a defender. They were a divine defender. But because the fighter was the martial defender and the martial power source kind of had, notes or subtexture of being a striker, the fighter actually did do more damage than the other defenders in the game because that martial power source kind of came through. The same way, by the way, that the divine power source sort of had notes of being a leader, a healer, a buffer, a supporter. And if you look at the paladin, which is a divine defender, they're a defender just like the fighter, but they have these extra abilities to heal and support their allies that a fighter does not get. And so there's always this really, really cool, sort of interplay between all of those. John's saying 4E. Absolutely. In fact, John, one of in our 4E campaign, our first one that went 1 to 30, we had a dwarven fighter named of Glortek and played by our buddy Rich Camp. And his character focused on the brutal, I can't remember what it's called, like the brutal fighter. It was from Martial Power 1, the one where you could get temporary hit points when you attack people. And he eventually took Paragon Path and an Epic Destiny that let him take some other powers. And his character was a damage dealing machine. I mean, just a crazy damage dealer. Our rogue was probably better at like specific high burst DPS, but our fighter really did lean into their striker sub role pretty well. Don't get me wrong. He was also a hell of a fighter, Exactly, Frostjack. You got it right. You definitely got it right. Did having explicit roles in 4E make parties more likely to cooperate or synergize than 5E, where I tended to mostly see DPS races? Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, certain character classes just really weren't equipped. Everybody could attack, everybody could do damage, but there were certain classes that just were much better at doing damage than doing other classes were. So there's kind of a, there's definitely an idea of like stay in your lane and, kind of do what you're good at. But that being said, 4th edition has so many feats and so many Paragon Paths and so many Epic Destinies that you could pretty much build kind of anything you wanted. How did anti-magic fields work in 4th edition? Sounds like they'd be devastating to certain classes. I don't think they did anything or that they existed would be what I would say. I mean, case in point, Cybersmith. Let's take a look at Dispel Magic in 4th edition D&D. If you're familiar with Dispel Magic in any edition of the game, you are aware that Dispel Magic typically has a laundry list of abilities or laundry paragraphs of text about what it does. Here we go. I believe it is heroic utility. It's been like 10 years, so give me. Oh, that's the Warlord. Jeez. All right. Here it is. I was right. It is a heroic utility. Here is Dispel Magic. It's a daily arcane power that has a range of 10 squares, aka 50 feet. You can target one conjuration effect or one zone effect. You attack it, your intelligence attack versus the will defense of the creator. And if you hit it, it is destroyed and all of its effects end. That's Dispel Magic in 4th edition. It's like super, super quick and sweet. Yeah, there's no disjunction. There's nothing. 4th edition, remember, was trying to bring in a lot of gamist. The idea of power source is interesting. So even a martial zone could it be dispelled? Yes, Cybersmith, although I doubt you would ever see a martial zone. But Cybersmith, you actually hit upon something which is some people complained about, by the way. If there was, for some odd reason, a martial zone, and I don't think there was, but if there was, a dispel magic would dispel it because that is what the rules of the game said. 4th edition, like Pathfinder 2nd edition, said, look, the rules kind of take precedence over what makes the most sense. I don't know what you need to do inside your head. Make it work. You figure out why it makes sense, and we'll move on from there. All right. Lastly, 5th edition. So 5th edition fighter is a little strange to me because of the nature of subclasses. The fighter in 5th edition feels like they were trying to take everything from 4th edition and make it stick it in here as a subclass, but at the same time create this character that is strangely capable of being like this one-shot Nova cannon. Again, I have not played a lot of 5th edition, but specifically, you start off by choosing a fighting style, which again is, that trend of locking you into being a particular type of character. I know that when we played our recent 5e campaign, we had 2 fighters. We were playing like kind of an old school 5e game who had the protection fighting style. And you know what? It was boring as shit, but it was very, very effective to give somebody disadvantage every time they attacked. But then they got this action surge, which lets you take 2 actions in one turn, which was obviously very, very, very powerful. And then you get it back on a short rest. And that was really, really powerful when you could make a bunch of extra attacks. And at 5th level, you start making 2 attacks on your turn. And so there's no multiple attack penalty or anything. I mean, even in 3rd edition, your iterative attacks at least got a penalty. It was just like Pathfinder 2, by the way, which is just like Pathfinder 1, which was -5, right? I mean, multiple attack penalty basically came from 3rd edition D&D anyways. +0, -5, -10. Hell, you went all the way to -15 in 3rd edition or Pathfinder 1. But in 5th edition, you don't get any penalties to attack. Of course, it's flat math. And then you get your martial archetypes. And the champion is basically just, I don't want to do anything special. I just want to kind of, hit more and crit more. And the battle master is basically them taking the 4th edition warlord and fighter class and sort of making it into 5th edition and adding these superiority dice, which are very similar to the idea of a, encounter power. By the way, action surge. You can use this on your turn. You take an additional action. You can use this feature once per short rest. How is that not an encounter power? It literally is. I mean, it is the definition of an encounter power, but because they don't call it an encounter power, because they say, you get this back when you take a short rest, people had no problems with it. So yeah, the Battle Master was interesting, although I do feel like all these powers were sort of underwhelming. And then you had this weird Gish, which this whole Eldritch Knight existing as a subclass under the fighter never made any sense to me whatsoever. I don't know what they were trying to do with this fighter. So anyways, point is, the 5th edition fighter was kind of an amalgamation of everything that had come before it, because, no longer do characters have this idea of being better at attacks, right? I mean, in 5th edition, everybody uses the same proficiency progression. I do know that fighters do get more ASIs than other classes. And if you're using feats, that means that they can pick up more feats. And of course, there's like 5 or 6 feats in 5th edition, which are incredibly broken, like, Great Weapon Mastery, Great Weapon Specialization, Lucky, and things like that. And as you point out, they get more attacks than anyone else. I know a lot of classes get up to 2 extra attacks, or maybe 3, but like the fighter gets all the way up to 3 extra attacks plus 1. I mean, I think that the fighter in 5th edition is more interesting than the fighter in 3rd edition. I'll say that. I think that between combination of subclass and, action surge and second wind. The 5th edition fighter definitely has a lot of 4E elements to it, especially the Battle Master. And as a result, I kind of like the class. So that brings us back to our friend, the Pathfinder 2nd edition fighter. And we can kind of see that we have come kind of full circle here a little bit, because now we're playing Pathfinder 2nd edition, and now everybody gets a class feat, right? I mean, in some ways, the fighter is very similar to the Pathfinder 1 fighter, right? I mean, the fighter's still getting, attacks, weapon attacks, all this other stuff. But now we're adding our level. Everyone adds their level, right? In Pathfinder 1, the fighter got that base attack bonus of +1 every level. Well, everyone gets that now. Everyone gets their level, every level. We have this proficiency system, which we layer on top of it. Okay. We get feats, but now everybody gets a class feat at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and then the non-spellcasters get one at 1. So in 3rd edition or in Pathfinder 1, that's what the fighter got. The fighter got all these extra feats. Well, now they don't get that. They kind of get that a little bit, because they get this ability here, this combat flexibility at level 9, and then they get greater flexibility or something. Don't know where it is. Improved flexibility at 15, which let you sort of pick an additional feat and then eventually an additional 2 feats that are kind of usable for the day. But outside of that, the fighter just gets, higher proficiencies and more damage, and they deal with all of that. So you might look at the fighter and say, so the fighter sucks in Pathfinder 2? No, because the only thing that they could do to make the fighter better, outside of giving them some really good feats to choose from, because everybody gets the same number of feats, is this proficiency system. Because everybody gets +1 per level. Can't change that. But what about the proficiency system? Well, it goes all the way to legendary. What if fighters are the only character class that goes to legendary? In fact, what if they start at all points of the game, they are 1 level of proficiency higher than everybody else? Everyone else starts to trained with their weapon. The fighter starts with expert. And then they go to master at level 5. And then they go to legendary at level 13, which no other class will get. This means that the fighter gets +2 to attack again over all other classes, save gunslinger, in the game. And because of the way that Pathfinder 2nd edition is created, this makes the fighter one of the most brutally effective character classes in the game. It is aided or compounded by the fact that a bunch of other classes, and we're going to get into this, but a bunch of the other classes, namely the spellcasters, had their powers significantly reduced. Don't get me wrong. I don't think spellcasters are horrible. I think some of them, like sorcerer and stuff, are completely busted. Psychic as well. I think Bard is great. So, and heal is probably the most broken spell in the game, honestly. But spells or casters are not on the same level as they used to be. Even the spell system itself, the ranges of so many spells, has been greatly shrunk down. We have some weird spells like Chain Lightning and Fireball, which stand out at 500 feet. But for the most part, these spells are all 30 feet, 60 feet. You have a couple of them at 120. But for the most part, most of your spells are 30 and 60. And the days of instant killing people with spells is pretty much way over. You have to crit fail twice, and they have to be higher level than you. It's a whole thing. So that means that the spell casting has gotten a little, got a little nerfed. So already the fighter sort of steps up into that role. But because they built a system where the math is so incredibly tight, and because they introduced this idea that you can critically hit when you get 10 or more on an attack roll, it means that not only does the fighter hit more, the fighter crits more. And one of the biggest things in this game, which to be fair is changing a little bit with the remaster, is that critting is worth more than just 2 attacks. crit does double damage. So you might think, oh, so critting an opponent and hitting an opponent twice are equivalent, and they are not. And the reason for this is because your weapon will have a critical specialization effect, which you'll start to apply at level 5. And most fighters will end up with runes on their weapons, magical runes on your weapons, which have an additional effect or only have an effect on a critical hit. And some of these critical specialization effects, like hammer and flail, which we are hearing is going to get changed in remastered, are very, very powerful. And that's a great, Bruno, that's a great point as well. Deadly and fatal are fantastic points to bring up as well. Yeah, Bruno, that's a fantastic example. So, the critting is more than just double damage. It's extra weapon traits. It's if you have a frost rune on your weapon, now they have to make a saving throw or become slowed. If you have a fear rune on your weapon, now they're frightened 2 or frightened 3. If you have a crushing rune on your maul, now the character is not only prone from the hammer's critical specialization effect, the character is also enfeebled 2, clumsy 2. So their armor class drops by 4. So the fighter has not only just done a ton of damage, they have debuffed that enemy by lowering their armor class, putting them on the ground, making their strength effective, giving them a penalty to attack rolls and damage rolls, making it so that if they stand up, they and everybody else around them will get an attack of opportunity, right? Good point. Yes, a critical hit gets through damage reduction. Exactly. It's also a good point too. So critically, to understand why the fighter is so powerful in Pathfinder 2, I think you really have to understand that part of it is because of the meta, in my opinion, of Pathfinder 2 is around, and Priest got it exactly right, is around heavier hits less often, right? And I agree to a certain extent with Cybersmith, which is, it's kind of a necessary change. Pathfinder 1 was very nearly full attack or go home the game. And I agree. Pathfinder 1 was about spray and pray, right? And just attack. In my experience playing the game as a player and as a game master for the last 3 years and change, Pathfinder 2nd Edition is better, or you're more optimal because of the multiple attack penalty. Okay, we are very opposite of 5th Edition here, right? Where a fighter gets multiple attacks and all of those attacks have no penalty whatsoever. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, even the first multiple attack penalty of -5 is a huge penalty. It really is. It's a huge penalty. And forget about the third one. So this means that you are incentivized to try to get as much value out of one attack as you can. Now, in the days of yore, you only critically hit on a 20 or maybe a 19 through 20 if you had like improved crit, but it was independent of your attack bonus. This meant that past a certain point, it really didn't make any sense to keep buffing your attack roll. Yeah, sure. You might go from having an 80% chance to hit to a 90% chance of hit. And that is something. But the marginal gain there, is pretty small, right? The percent increase to go from 80 points to 90 points isn't that high. Having a really high attack bonus didn't make you hit any harder. The only way you crit was if you rolled an actual 20 on your D20. Pathfinder 2 changed that. Pathfinder 2 made it so that not only do you hit more often, you crit more often. And that means, to a certain extent, the name of the game in Pathfinder 2 is figure out how many ways you have to get your attack bonus higher and get their armor class lower. And as a result of this, it means that people are going to look everywhere they can to find the most consistent and best and easiest ways to get yourself a high attack bonus or to put a penalty on your enemies. As a result of this, people are looking for the best way to get a status bonus to their armor, to their attack roll. Maybe a heroism spell, or a bard's inspire courage, or maybe a cleric's bless spell at lower levels. You're going to want to have the best item bonus to your attack roll that you can. That means getting the best potency rune for your level. You want to have a +1 potency rune by level 2 or 3. You want to have a +2 potency rune by level 10 or 11. You want to have a +3 potency rune by level 16, right? So you want to keep up with that. So that's status. That's item. You want to have the highest circumstance bonus that you can in the game. That means using feats or actions like aid that grant a circumstance bonus, or something like guiding shot or assisting shot, right? All of these things are going to stack your bonus. But at the end of the day, the fighter is always going to be 2 points higher than everybody else, except for the gunslinger, because of their proficiency. And no one can touch that. And that means that the fighter is going to hit and crit more. But it's more than that. And I want to point this out. All right. Here is our fighter DC chart that we have been sort of using. I'm sorry, a Pathfinder 2 proficiency chart that we've been using. And what we can see here is that, as expected, the fighter, outside of the gunslinger, is the best in the game. In fact, actually, arguably, the fighter is the best in the game because eventually, although it doesn't really mean much, eventually the fighter will end up getting legendary proficiency in all weapons, not just their one special degree group. But at level 13, we can see that the gunslinger and the fighter both get legendary proficiency in a chosen group. And for the gunslinger, it has to be some sort of ranged attack bonus. But eventually, the fighter does pick up legendary in all weapons. Funny, interesting side note to that. Realize that everyone gets weapon specialization at 7 and greater weapon specialization at 15. Realize that those are keyed to your proficiency bonus, which means that at level 15, when everybody picks up greater weapon specialization, they're adding +6 to their damage rolls because they're master. The fighter is adding +8. So they get more value out of the greater weapon specialization. And that extra +2 damage is equivalent to, 4 points of strength, which in this game is not hard, which is not easy to get. It's pretty hard to get. So the fighter obviously is insane at weapon progression, right? Which is insane. But we can also see that, again, are they the champion? No. But they get master armor proficiency in heavy, by the way. You can see that, by the way, there's only two core classes that get heavy armor proficiency: fighter and champion. And yeah, the champion's the GOAT, but the fighter is not, is doing pretty good, right? Pretty damn good. Heavy armor and gets master at level 17. So again, going to have an incredibly high armor class. And we just said, because of that attack bonus, they're doing an insane amount of damage and an insane amount of debuffing and an insane amount of control. But okay, spell casting, they get nothing. All right, they got to be bad at something. But this is what's really interesting to me. Saves. Fighters have great saves in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Fortitude, right? Obviously, they're going to be great at fortitude. Now, they're not going to get legendary like the barbarian does. Barbarian's got to have something that they get. But the fighter starts at expert. They get master very early. I mean, the barbarian gets master at 7, and the fighter gets master at 9. I mean, they get there really, really quickly. And that is pretty sweet. Reflex, guess what? Fighter gets expert. Like, they start with the same reflex as a rogue or a ranger. And not only does the fighter eventually get master, they also get save specialization, which means that if they get a success, right, it's treated as a critical success. They get evasion. The fighter is this nimble person able to dodge out of the way. It also means that the fighter has a really good chance of avoiding things like trips and the like. I should also note, by the way, that the fighter also gets Juggernaut, so their fortitude saves get improved as well. And then lastly, we get to will saves. You're like, okay, so they're going to be bad at will saves. And sure enough, they do start at trained, but 3 levels later, they are essentially the same as everyone else, except for the poor alchemist who doesn't get expert till 7. But not only do they become an expert, they get this ability called bravery, which makes them more likely to pass fear-based effects, and to have be less affected by frightened. And if you've ever been frightened in Pathfinder 2, you know that a lot of the times you are getting demoralized by your GM with a throwaway third action, or there's some sort of aura or spell, and you're getting frightened 1. And bravery reduces that to frightened 0. That is incredibly powerful. And being frightened is really annoying. The fighter's bravery ability is incredibly powerful. So the fighters get fantastic saves. They really end up with master, expert, and with save specializations in kind of all 3 saves, which is incredible. But we're not done then, because in this edition of the game, initiative is tied to usually your perception. So the fighter starts off with excellent expert level perception, which goes to master at level 7. And you get a further bonus to your initiative checks when you're using perception to start your initiative. It's incredible. So the character has great reflexes, fantastic fortitude, really reasonably good will, an extra layer of protection against fear. They have an incredible perception. They've got arguably the second best armor proficiency in the game and the best weapon proficiency in the game, in an addition where crits matter more and spells have been weakened. This makes the fighter just an incredible powerhouse of power and capability. And we learned from Remastered, they're getting rid of open. Not that that ever matters much, but arguably it is a buff to the fighter. The one thing I do want to talk about, and just seeing here if I missed any chats here. I did. Cybersmith said, the higher proficiency also makes fighters great at support. A level 5 human fighter can aid for an average of 2.05 with no chance to worse the aided strike. Absolutely right. And it goes without saying that at higher levels, like 13, a fighter is going to have legendary proficiency in their weapon. They are going to be able to hit the DC 20 crit for an aid almost every single time, which means they can hand out a massive and unthinkably large +4 bonus to hit at level 13. That is such a powerful aid action that it is difficult to comprehend. And you start thinking about that. Okay, +4 to hit's pretty nice. Okay, but what if you've also cast a heroism spell or an inspire courage or greatness from your bard on that same character? Now they might have a +2 or a +3 status bonus. You're giving them a +7 to hit. What if that foe is flat-footed? Maybe they got knocked prone, or maybe they're flanked. Their armor class is down by 2 points. What if you hit them with a debuff spell that made them clumsy or frightened? They might be frightened 2 or clumsy 2, clumsy 3. Now their armor class is down by another 2 points. So their armor class is down by 4. Your attack bonus is up by 7. That's an 11-point difference. That's enough to make your character go from I needed an 11 to hit them to now I critically hit them on a 10. Fighters are incredible at support in this game. Yeah, teamwork makes the dream work. Absolutely. Absolutely. Boothby says, every time my fighter aids, the person I'm aiding rolls a natural 20 and wastes my aid. It's sad. I keep trying to use it as a good opportunity to show my group how good it is. You know, you could just tell them, say, the reason you rolled a nat 20 is because I aided you. +11 easily turns a miss into a critical hit. That is actually true. Yeah. It's an incredibly powerful ability that the fighter has. And again, other characters can aid too. There's no doubt about it. But there is something else that makes the fighters a little bit better at aiding. We've done 4 or 5 of these class reviews. And one of the things that we always cover is the subclass, the thief, the rogue's racket, the bard's muse. The fighter doesn't get one of those. The fighter has feats, and like you would expect in Pathfinder 2, right? Some of the feats are kind of following a similar theme. You know, you have a feat for dual wielding. You have a feat that's, you know, good for shooting a bow. You have a feat that's good for, we're snagging strike. You have a feat that's good for being one-handed melee weapon with an open free hand. So there's a lot of these, you know, kind of feat ideas, because to be fair, like some of these feats don't necessarily work well together. If you take, you know, double slice, which lets you attack
Sean
twice.
Clayton tipped $60.
Oh,
looking forward to the BTS smile.
There it is. Sean. Well done, Sean. Thank you very much.
I am strong.
This is for everybody in the chat. I'm going to drink some of my latte. Sean, with that $60 tip on top of everything that we've gotten today from GM Scott, from Rick S., from Henry, not to mention all of the super chats from John, Cybersmith, and now our final John, Henry, and Cybersmith. We have hit all of our goals, and that means we are going to be walking you through a root instructional system where you're going to get to see me get really frustrated with Bob as he doesn't understand it. So nicely done. Nicely done, Sean. Thank you so much for that. Thank you everybody for supporting us, and let's keep going, because you guys are being awesome and I really respect that. Thank you again for the incredible support, everybody. You know, again, laugh my half of the shade. Who got shaded? Oh, we love Bob. I didn't even notice that I was making fun of him. It just happens immediately. Listen, I love Bob too, but the guy, listen, you run a game for him sometime, and you tell me, then we'll compare notes, and you'll see how frustrated you get. So what I was saying with the fighter, you know, double slice, which lets you attack twice for no multiple attack penalty, and, you know, point blank shot are not necessarily feats that combo well together, but they could. Like, your fighter could have a backup to secondary weapon and use double slice and then pull out their bow and go into the point blank shot stance. There's no reason that you can't do that. So the fighter has this really cool concept where they don't get tied into a certain, you know, build or a certain path because that they chose at level 1 because of their, you know, muse, or because of their, you know, instinct, or, you know, any of those things. But I mentioned before that the fighter is better at aiding than some of the other classes. And that's not just because they start off at a higher level of proficiency. One of the other things that's really awesome about the fighter is, and by the way, the fighter gets some of the best feats in the game. We'll go through some of my personal favorites, and I'd love to hear from some of yours as well. But the fighter is also incredibly... Cybersmith, $10. Let me finish my thought, Cybersmith, then I'll call it in. The fighter is extremely action efficient. Every other class that we've talked about, from the barbarian, we haven't really talked about it yet, but from the barbarian to the ranger to the monk, right? They all have action taxes built into the game to do their thing, right? The ranger needs to hunt their prey. The barbarian needs to rage. The swashbuckler needs to get panache. The magus needs to reload their spell strike. Even the rogue, to a certain extent, needs to get flat-footed. And yes, as we point out in the rogue, one of the reasons why the rogue is pretty good is a lot of the times, the only thing that you need to do is stride to the flank, which you should probably be doing anyways. And if you're a melee character, would have to do anyways in order to, you know, get into melee to be able to use your weapon. But if that isn't available, or, you know, something like that, you're going to be, you know, feinting, or, you know, doing some sort of tumble through in order to try to make them flat-footed. You're going to be eating up actions in order to just even be able to turn on what your class can do. Not to mention that some of those are only one action, like the barbarian rages or the monk enters a stance, but sometimes those carry downsides as well. Rage lowers your armor class and makes you unable to take concentration actions, which include readying. A monk's stance precludes you from using certain types of attacks, right? So the fighter gets this incredible flexibility with these really, really quality solid feats. But more importantly, they're doing all this critting, they're doing all this hitting, but the fighter doesn't have to jump through any hoops. There's no setup cost for what the fighter can do. The fighter just gonna fight, and that's all they do. And that means they're really, really good at it. Not to mention, they get a lot of pretty good action economy enhancing feats. Like, for example, at level 1, you might pick up sudden charge, which we all know and love. It's a barbarian feat as well. But this is 2 actions, and it's going to allow your character to move twice and then attack. So that means that you are getting 3 actions of value for just 2 actions. But further on down the line, your character might pick up combat grab at the next level. Well, combat grab lets you make a melee strike while keeping a hand free. And if it hits, you then grab the target. Well, guess what? And by the way, this has the press trait, which means you can only do this as a follow-up attack. In other words, your multiple attack penalty can't be 0 when you do this. But this is essentially an attack and a grapple check, except you don't need to make 2 different checks. You can just make 1 attack, which is what you're really good at anyways, by the way. And if you do hit, you get to do your damage. You get to do everything. Oh, and you grab them. But think about it. If your fighter starts the fight 50 feet away, they sudden charge. They take 2 strides, and then they make a strike, which they might crit on. Then they follow up with a combat grab, which is a strike plus a grab. Your fighter in 3 actions has taken 5 actions worth of activity, and sudden charge and combat grab all tie off of your attack roll, which is the best in the game. So not only are you doing, oh, by the way, you've also covered a lot of distance, you've hit them twice, and now they're grabbed, which, as we've covered on this channel many times, including an entire combat and tactics video, is a fantastic defensive, protective stance. There's no taunting or marking in Pathfinder 2nd edition like there was in prior edition, like in 4th edition. But grappling people is probably better. And so your fighter has taken 5 actions worth of activity, and they've done a bunch of damage with the highest chance to crit in the game, and they've locked down an opponent with a grapple. Blood Earnest, I appreciate the effort, buddy. Enjoy the rest of the VOD. Appreciate you staying up with us, and thank you for your comments, and thank you for your chats. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right, Cybersmith, let's get this. Cybersmith came in and says, something I do appreciate about 2nd edition, I assume you mean Pathfinder, is how it emphasizes weapon and freehand as a valid and viable choice organically. Other systems either make it weak or crudely mandate it. Yeah, Cybersmith, I agree with you. In fact, actually, my fighter from Smith's first Pathfinder 2nd edition campaign was a bastard sword one-handed specialist. And actually, something that I think is really interesting about this fighting style is if you look at some of your favorite movies, right? If you look at Aragorn, if you look at Mad Mardigan from the Willow movies, if you look at, like, most of the time, a lot of the times, the character is usually wielding a sword that can go between 1- and 2-handed, aka a bastard sword, and a lot of the times they are using it one-handed so that they can do something else with their other hand. Punch a guy out, grab another guy and use him as a shield as an arrow comes in, swing off of something or parkour off of something. So I think it's very, very common in especially fiction to see characters who just use a sword one-handed. But it never made any sense in prior editions of the game, because it was like, why wouldn't you have a 2-handed weapon or 2 weapons or a shield? There's no real advantage to be gained. But feats like combat grab really, in my opinion, I think this is one of the top tier feats in the game, honestly. Because my thought process on this is, your character has a warhammer, okay? You close in, sudden charge maybe. You attack them. You have the absolute highest attack roll in the game. You hit them with your hammer. You crit them. They're prone. Maybe you have a crushing rune. Now they're clumsy, right? So now their AC is down by 4. Now you have to make a follow-up attack, but it's at -5, but their AC is down by 4. So you're only down by 1 point. And you started off +2 higher than everybody else. This means that your map attack is 1 point higher than everybody else's first attack in the game. And then if you hit them, they are prone, crushed, prone, enfeebled, clumsy, grappled at your feet with you with an attack of opportunity ready to go. It is insane. I think this is one of the best feats in the game for that kind of play, that style of play. I think it's incredible. So I'm completely in agreement with you there, Cybersmith. Not only do I think it's viable, I think it's really great. And please, everybody, let me ask your questions. Let me know. I'm going to put a poll up. I don't know how many people we got. We got 96. All right, I'm going to put a poll up and let's see what you people think. We're going to start really simple, which is going to say, do you like the fighter in a PF2? All right. And one of the reasons I'm asking this poll is because I'm really interested to get your feedback on how many of you feel like the fighter is boring. This is a common complaint that I see in the game. There's a 90 plus of you out there. So I think, I like to think that you all are a more sophisticated and refined Pathfinder 2nd Edition audience. And it's interesting to me when people say that the fighter is boring, because there are so many classes in this game whose class gives them essentially, let me rephrase another way. A lot of people say, oh, the fighter is only good at fighting. Well, there's a lot of classes that basically have class feats that only give them an advantage in combat. But the fighter gets the same number of skill feats as any other class. So, and a fighter could be just as trained or expert as nearly anybody else. Obviously, the rogue or the investigator is going to have a lot more skill trains, but a fighter's going to have their 3 or 4 or 5, 3 or 4 skills that they're able to get up to expert, master, legend. And eventually at the same level as the rogue or the investigator. And you could be a fighter who is really good at arcane or really good at stealth or really good at survival. So I think Pathfinder 2nd Edition, actually, it does the best job at removing the silo from the fighter, right? Because before, the fighter was just, they were 2 skill points a level. They only had like 3 class skills. So you could only be like jump, athletics, ride. It was really, really boring. Now you can just take what between your background and skill training and skill feats, you could be whatever you want to be. And add, and look, and the core of the game is still based around combat. There's no doubt about that, right? We can't get away from that. But there's so many classes that are built around combat, and my thing is like, man, look, I like to hit. I don't know about you all, but I like to hit, because whether you want to admit it or not, there's no penalty, or there's no prize for second place in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. If you miss, you get nothing. Good day, sir. You lose, right? I said good day. You're out. It doesn't matter how cool your spell strike is. It doesn't matter how awesome your rage damage is. It doesn't matter how incredible your sneak attack is. If you miss, you get nothing. Combats in Pathfinder 2nd Edition are 3 to 4 to 5 rounds at the long end. And even if your combat goes past that, it's usually pretty well decided and you're just kind of doing cleanup. That means your character only has a handful of options in order to actually do something and contribute. If your character misses on your turn, with that first attack especially, you're double fucked, because not only did you miss and not do anything, but now you are statistically much less likely to do anything else, especially if you continue to attack. And so for me, just as a player, forget the game mechanics, forget the balance, right? As a player sitting at the table with my fellow players or virtual tabletop, I don't want to be like, yeah, I didn't do anything this round. I mean, I moved, I attacked, whatever, but I missed, so nothing happened. I hate that. I mean, I hate that in general. We did a whole video about why missing sucks. So anything that they can give me in a game that is going to allow me to hit more and feel like I'm making an impact more is something that I want to do. It's one of the reasons why I love this class in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. All right. Ending the poll. So we had 63% of you say that it was amazing. 21% said it's okay. Only 15% said it's good but boring, and 0% of you said it was bad. So I feel like these are pretty solid results, and I tend to agree with everybody here. Let me see what some of you said. I saw some chat scroll by, and I do definitely want to sort of lean into this here. Roxley says, I do think in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, two-handed weapons are a bit of a trap. The extra damage is nice, but limits a lot of cool options. Roxley, I agree with that. Actually, I agree with that big time. I only think two-handed weapons are worth it if your character is going to go sort of the power attack. What's the inventor? Overpowering strike or something like that. Piston strike, overcharge strike. Like, you need to get more value out of your increased weapon damage dice than just attacking. You need to go big. You need to have like something like a power attack, which at 10th level is adding 2 extra weapon dice of damage and really compound that advantage. But if you're not going to do that, I agree with you. I do think it's a bit of a trap. And quite frankly, the grip changing rules and it taking an action, I think is absolutely horrendous. There are a lot of other things that I want to be able to do in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Your fighter who's going, another reason, your fighter that's the, one-handed weapon and a free hand, that means that they can be really good at medicine. Use their skill feats to pick up battlefield medicine and run around on combat and heal people for a single action, because all you need is a free hand and you can wear your tools. If you're wielding a two-handed character, sure, you can let go. But now to be able to start fighting again, you have to burn another action to re-equip on your sword. So I actually don't like I don't like two-handed weapons. Two weapons has the same problem, arguably even worse, because it's, you can't just, you have to drop your weapon entirely. But two weapons makes up for it because double slice is probably the most powerful feat in the game. And as a result of this, your character is going to hit a lot, and your character is going to do a lot of damage. And this is going to give you your best chance in the game to score at least one crit. And because of all the reasons I talked about, getting that first crit off on an opponent is usually historically how you sort of set up the chain of dominoes to fall and really kind of leverage in on it. Because if my character has a crushing rune and a hammer or flail weapon, then once I get a critical hit off, that foe is prone and enfeebled and clumsy, which means that not only me, but my party members are all going to be able to jump on that and just, wail this, slam this person into the ground. Double slice gives me 2 bites at the apple because I get to make 2 attacks. And that's really, really powerful. Let's see here. So, Mike, let me go through the rest of the chats, Mike, and then I want to talk about that, about fighter archetype. The fighter is not mechanically boring, but rather thematically boring. Yeah, I agree with you, Shadow. I think part of the, maybe you're right. To a extent that the fighter is thematically boring. You are absolutely correct. And maybe it's because people expect for the class or the ancestry to do the heavy lifting for them of being interesting. And again, I'm not trying to throw shade, but I'm going to throw shade on people. I think a lot of people are really boring and they make really boring characters, but they think, oh, but if I'm a leshy witch, that makes me cool. No, it doesn't. Like, being a human fighter to them is boring. Being a leshy witch to them is automatically exciting. It prices you in to my character is cool and edgy and unique tier. And it doesn't. I think your leshy witch is boring too. It's not about the class and it's not about the ancestry. There is no class or ancestry that is going to automatically make your character cool or fun or exciting. You have to do that. And, you know, maybe there are people out there who certainly enjoy playing those classes, and that's totally reasonable because you really like that flavor, but it doesn't make you interesting. And it at the very least, it's only interesting to you. Ford says, I mean, it's boring because every character I think to make, there's a thought in the back of my mind that the character would be mechanically better as a fighter. And this kind of gets to what Mike T was saying about Ford, about the fighter archetype as well. Like, the fact of the matter is that most classes, combat classes, are usually better if you were just a fighter who then took archetypes into those other classes. Now, this isn't 100% the case or the truth, but the fact of the matter is all of these classes' cool abilities all tie off of hitting. And that means in order to start the chain of coolness, you have to hit. And the fighter is just the best at hitting. There's no way to get around that. And the game doesn't give you any sort of tools to do that. So what ends up happening is if you want to be the really cool ranger archer, but it's like, well, yeah, but, and to be fair, at the very highest of levels, the ranger does perform. Or if you want to be a really cool dual weapon ranger, all of those things still rely on hitting, and the fighter does it better. So that character is going to be more of that fantasy, more of that idea than, say, the class that seems like it should be made for it. Let's see. The fighter isn't boring, it isn't overpowered, and it isn't broken. I think it is overpowered simply because it overshadows the other combative classes. I'm sorry, but and we've done the math on this, like the fighter out damages the barbarian. Not every build of the barbarian, not every build of the fighter, but if you take a really good fighter build that's built for damage, and you take a really good barbarian build that's built for damage, the fighter will out damage that barbarian. And the barbarian is spending an action to rage and getting a point of armor class penalty for raging and can't take concentrate actions while they're in the fight. So yeah, like I have a problem with that, like big time. One of the first things that made me almost bounce off of this game was when I realized that at all levels of the game, a fighter is a better hand-to-hand combatant than the monk. That still blows my mind. That still boggles my mind that that's even true. Like the gunslinger gets expert master legend in guns. How the fuck does the monk not have expert master legend in their unarmed attacks? That boggles my mind. I don't even understand it. So yeah. Very, 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 very silly that the class is just so tied to that. Great Knoll with Crunch can grapple with no hands free. Yes, because the bite has grapple trait. Yes. Yep. Nope. That's really cool. I personally would not allow people to be Knolls, but they're changing Knolls in Galarian, so they're going away from demonic, crazed, bloodthirsty worshippers of Yenogu to sort of the more Mwangi Knoll, which is a little bit more, whatever the name of that stupid Knoll is that everybody loves. Root Esper Root or something. I think everybody would watch this video. I mean, even if you don't like the fighter, you're going to watch this video, Cybersmith. Anchor Root. Thank you. Anchor Root. What did I say? Esper Root. I got the root part right. I mean, I'm something here. Cybersmith was disagreeing with me. The barbarian will always have better fort and more hit points, better at surviving in the wild or wading through the acid. Now, see, it's the better at surviving in the wild that I disagree with, Cybersmith. Why? Why would the barbarian be better at surviving in the wild? There's no reason. They don't get some sort of bonus to survival checks unless I missed that. They get the same number of skill fates as anybody else. King Fate says, fighters +2 working with everything makes them super flexible. So flexible that with free archetype, the flex all over everyone else's shtick. Exactly. And this is kind of ultimately the point that I was trying to make which is that the fighter as a core chassis, because again, we've talked about this before on these channels or on these shows. This part here, this there we go. This class features, this never changes, right? If you're a wizard and you take every single one of your feats as fighter dedication, then at the end of the game, your attack proficiency is going to be expert, because that is decided by this core progression of your class feature. This is the one big thing that they've done differently than 5th edition, 3rd edition, right? Which is in first, 3rd edition and 5th edition D&D, right? You can cherry pick class features. You can get some of it from this and some of that from this, and you kind of get the best of both worlds, which is how you end up with busted, cheesy ass multi-class builds. They have really tried in this game hard to avoid doing that because you can't cherry pick the features. But if you're the fighter, you get all the features, which means you get all of the cool, abilities, including weapon proficiency, because that's the only thing that fighters get. But if you go to archetype and you archetype into another class, a lot of times you can get a lot of the same benefit of that class, but you get to maintain that fighter chassis, which gives you a better attack bonus. And that means you can kind of be better at that other, at what that other class is trying to do. Especially if you include some other forms of archetypes. If you're doing free archetype, forget about it. Free archetype fighter is insane. I don't want to, say that this is 100% the case, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that my fighter from Smith's last Pathfinder 2 campaign is probably easily one of, if not the most powerful types of characters that you could have in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Who's a human fighter. He, 20th level. He dual wielded gnomish flick maces. This is pre-nerf. So they were D8s. Dual wielded with free archetype. Had a high charisma, which he used to multi-class free archetype into champion, to pick up land hands and to pick up champion's reaction. So those were 3. Then used human ancestry feats along with more free archetypes to pick up dual weapon warrior, so that they would get the additional benefits that you get from double slicing, including the flensing strike, which lets him do auto damage after he hits. And then also on top of that, because of his charisma and just a small investment of feats of a dedication and basic spellcasting, expert spellcasting, master spellcasting, and spellcasting breath, also ended the game with 16 spell slots all the way up to 8th level of the occult tradition, which I think is one of the strongest ones for you, because not only do you get access to True Strike, but you also get access to the buff spells like Heroism, Haste, Slow. Like Arcane doesn't get Protection or Heroism, and the occult spell tradition does. And you get access to Magic Missile, which doesn't rely on a save, doesn't rely on a spell attack roll, so it doesn't matter that your proficiency is lower. And so in a pinch, if you need to, you can just whip out magic missiles if the enemy, for example, maybe has a physical immunity or has an insert armor class, on top of being able to, of course, True Strike at will. That character, which was this, again, fighter, free archetype, dual wielding, gnomish flick mace, champion plus dual weapon wielder plus sorcerer, was a one-man army. And was extremely, extremely powerful. The only thing you don't get is heal, but you do get soothe at least. But you also have lay on hands, so it kind of balances out. And it was just absurdly powerful, just incredibly powerful. There's a lot of ways to balance free archetype. Yeah, you could not let people multi-class, or there could be more of a restriction around multi-classing. Like maybe you could only take one multi-class dedication. Yep. Rule of cool. You are absolutely right. You could also, you get it at 20, you do get that 8th spell slot at level 20. So you can only probably do it for like the last 2 sessions of the game, or so, but you do get maze if you are so inclined to do so. And so it's just a fantastic, that character was on another level. Not to mention just setting the hell up out of my rest of my party. Just doing work, putting massive debuffs on people, not to mention they, had reach because of Gnomish Flick Mace. They had extra attacks of opportunity because of feats that they got from Fighter and at the time Champion, which used to stack. Now they don't stack, but they would be enlarged so that they would have reach like 15-foot reach. They were huge. They would have 20-foot reach and Champion reaction and Fighter attack of opportunity. I mean, it was... You could pick up Disrupting Stance if you thought you were going to go up against spellcasters. I mean, it was absolutely a completely busted experience. So fighters with free archetypes is, in my opinion, probably one of the most busted things that you can do. In fact, right now in Northern Reaches, I believe, free archetype isn't an option, but certain factions that you can join do give it to you, do potentially have the potential to give you free archetype. One such faction is called the Jagged Pine Pact, which was a forest in our first season of Northern Reaches that was actually cut down or destroyed, or mostly destroyed, by industrialists and settlers from Northport who wanted the resources of the woods and the land for farming, kind of a nature versus civilization conflict that civilization ended up winning. So now there's this Jagged Pine Pact of people who are pissed off about that, are sort of, eco-terrorists or eco-warriors. And they have gotten high enough level where they get Druid free archetype. And people are pointing out that if you're a Druid free archetype and you start as a fighter, then you can go the wild shape route with your fighter as your base, Druid as your free archetype. You get access to wild shape, which gives you a +2 status bonus on top of your attack roll. And +2 status bonus is pretty hard to get for pretty much the first 10 levels of the game, which means that the fighter in their unarmed attack not only already has the highest attack roll, but then they have a further +2 status bonus on top of that attack roll, meaning that their attack bonus is sometimes 4 higher than their fellow party members. So yeah, fighter plus free archetype is just completely busted. This feels like this is making the same assumptions for E-Mate, evaluating every class from a combat standpoint. OD&D didn't make this assumption, and I don't think PF2e does either. Actually, OD&D didn't balance anything, but more important than that, Cybersmith, original Dungeons & Dragons didn't have anything outside of combat. It only had rules for combat. There were no rules for skill checks. There were no rules for, skill feats. There were no rules for what a character could do or couldn't do. In original D&D, a fighting man or a thief or a cleric all had the same set of skills, which was nothing. That meant that if the fighter wanted to, talk someone into doing something, or if he wanted to survive in the wilderness, the only thing he had to do was explain to his dungeon master what was happening. Yes. Non-weapon, it was more like secondary skills, Matt, in first edition. Non-weapon proficiencies really became a thing in second edition, for sure. So yeah, exactly. Non-weapon proficiencies were sort of the precursors to that. And yeah, I mean, that is where you start to get this idea of, the fighter mechanically can only fight. But what I'm trying to say is, I think in Pathfinder 2, they actually did a good job of democratizing that. Skill feats and the way that the training system works, I think, unlocks classes like the fighter and the monk and, I'm just trying to think of other classes that the champion, right? These classes have historically been, lacking in skills and they lacking in cool abilities. But in Pathfinder 2nd edition, you're going to get 10 skill feats. You're going to get 10 skill improvements. You're going to start the game trained in maybe 5 or 6 skills, depending on your background and stuff like that. If you take free archetypes or even regular archetypes without a free archetype rule, you're going to pick up some additional trainings that way. So in some ways, your characters they've kind of democratized non-combat in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Yes, the rogue and the investigator still get, 1 a level, which is obviously insane. Arguably, you could say too much. I've heard people say, like, I run out of things to pick by the time I'm a level 15 rogue. I don't even know what to take anymore. But I think that characters feel more like, I love the idea that in Pathfinder 2nd edition, any character can pick up medicine. The fighter can pick up medicine. The monk can pick up medicine. Yeah, sure. The cleric with the high wisdom is going to be a little bit better at it. There's no doubt about that. But you could be good enough to get done what you need to get done. And hell, my fighter could pick up arcane, Sure, my int, especially if I have a higher int. So I think that the combat ability is what, in a sense, it's almost like AD&D. That's kind of really what matters the most, because the other things you can, easily fill in. Also, since we're talking here between friends, we all know the truth. Inside a combat, most GMs, most players too, are going to stick pretty closely to the rules. It's outside of combat, in, say, exploration mode, or during a social encounter, or during a wilderness scene, where a lot of times you're going to be able to bullshit your way into almost anything. If we were running a camping scene and the GM started describing how the first snows of winter have come early and a massive storm system is moving in off of the high plateau, katabatic winds are sweeping down through the forest, bringing chill and frost. And I basically start describing how it's going to get really cold. And your character goes, oh, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to gather some firewood. And, oh, you know what? I have a hammer in my backpack. I'm going to take some of these tree limbs. If we need to, maybe we can cut down one of these trees, but there's a bunch of dead wood you described. So maybe we can build a windbreak, build some sort of windbreak. Cause you said the wind was really what was driving it, right? I'm listening to you, GM. I'm paying attention to what you're saying. And I want to kind of, feel like I'm being rewarded by paying attention to what's going on in the campaign. So we're going to build a windbreak, and then we'll get a big fire going. And then, and the GM's going to go, yeah, that all sounds great. That's cool. Okay, cool. You have a fire and the cold isn't as bad. They're not going to go, okay, well, make a survival roll. I mean, arguably, per the rules of Pathfinder 2, they should. Because Pathfinder 2 should say, I don't care what your character is doing, make a skill check. But the fact of the matter is, between suggested advice that's in the GMG and just the way that people play and years of watching people like Matt Mercer and sort of the general zeitgeist of these games, most GMs are going to play combats strictly by the rules, and then outside of combat are going to allow a lot of bullshit to fly. Whether that's a social encounter, an exploration encounter, a geographical challenge encounter, no matter what that is, right? You're going to have a way to usually bullshit your way through it. And I'm not saying that that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's the way it is. And so as a result of that, I stand by pretty firm on my thing, which is the rules that matter the most are the combat rules, because those are the rules that are really going to get referenced. It's also the case where the rules often are the most life and death, and where the most is on the line. I'm not saying that there can't be a very important or risky social encounter or that, wilderness survival challenge that I just described, but combat is usually pretty black and white. Okay. We're going to live or we're going to die. And that means that is the one place where you can't, you can't fuck around. Let's see. Flan says, loving the knowledge you were laying down on us. It's insane how much you know. Well, Flan, I'm a huge nerd. Just a huge nerd. It's unbelievable how massive my nerddom is. Wait, that started to get kind of double entendre there. Isaiah says, all classes should be interesting and viable outside of combat. The same should be true in combat. They should be balanced separately, not against each other. Isaiah, I agree that what you just described is exactly what they try to do in 4th edition D&D. And people hated it. Turns out, for a lot of people, balance is what they say they want, but a lot of then people complain that balance is boring. So take that for what it's worth. Yes, river lore is always an option. How can we ever forget the power of the river lore? As they never once crossed mountains. Maybe they did one time. I think Bob got to use mountain lore one time, but they crossed 17 rivers. So it was absolutely hilarious. Yes, a lot of people, this is, John, for 3rd edition came out 23 years ago. There are people who, there are 30-year-olds playing today who were 7 when 3rd edition came out. So yeah, of course that was their first role-playing game. And 3rd edition, I mean, 5th edition is huge now. There's no doubt about it. But 3rd edition at the time, I mean, it was so everywhere in a way that even 2nd edition D&D had never been. 3rd edition and the OGL really just dominated the whole industry. And so many games and so many gamers came into the game system through 3rd edition. So I completely agree with you. I just think it's important because I think these game systems do have more tied back to where they came from than people might, understand at first blush. Well, John, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, again, I certainly didn't grow up playing OD&D. I mean, that came out in 1974. I was not born until the early 80s, so I was not playing that. I grew up playing, sort of a homebrew amalgamation of my cousin's 1st edition and 2nd edition game. So a lot of what I know from old school has just come from years of being interested in and reading these books and talking to people who did play in that era and reading old Dragon magazine articles or interviews with some of the authors and players from TSR at the time. So, I guess from that perspective, John, I'm kind of like a middle child, in the sense that I really grew up in the 90s, not the 80s. So I kind of had a foot in both worlds, but I grew up playing with my older cousin who was like 10 years older than me. And, he was a firmly 1st edition guy. So I kind of had this, kind of interesting perspective that maybe a lot of people don't have. Hassel says, social encounters are almost always pure bullshit at my tables. I hate having 8 charisma character never want to talk, fearing I'll ask them for a diplomacy roll. Hassel, it's a tough spot to be in because I get both sides of it. Like, I understand there's sort of 2 ways to approach role-playing games, right? Which is, I want to be able to control my character utterly, and whatever, they are just my avatar. I'm wearing my character as a suit. If I say something, my character says it. If I move my hand this way, my character moves that hand this way. Okay, we're not going to fight with swords, so we need our dice roll for that. But for a lot of other things, we don't need dice rolls because we can just figure it out as human beings. The other side of it says we are going to use dice. And the challenge of the game is, as players, as role players, figuring out why that result happened. So as an example, if you get into a negotiation and your character is really low charisma, but you roll really high, we know, me and the GM and everybody at the table knows that this encounter is going to go well, that it's going to end up with the person being friendly to us. But my character is not charismatic. My character's kind of an oaf. So the challenge, the fun for me is, as a GM and as a player, is, okay, so this is like an interesting acting challenge, or it's almost like we have to be script writers in the moment. And the dice took us in an unexpected place. This really shit character rolled really well, or maybe this really good character rolled really shitty. We now have to figure out a reason for that. The dice have declared that this is true in our world. This low charisma character has convinced the Duke or whatever to let them pass through their lands. I don't think we should leave it at that. I think we should role play that. The challenge for the player and for the GM and for the other players is, what did that look like? How did that happen? Maybe my character doesn't speak really well. And so he gets up there and he just starts talking to the Duke about hunting or about the battles he's been in. And, the king, he hates all this court bullshit, finery, people being polite all the time. He just wants to hear war stories. And him and the other fighter, they start getting into it and they start, having a mug of ale, and they're just, he's like, bring some wine. Tell me more about you were at the Battle of the Three Ridges. Like, I'd love to hear more about that. And right, that's what happened in that game. And we're adding flavor and context and all this fun stuff that happens for it, because we're not trying to play a game of, let me guess what words me, Derek, can say that will make GM Hassel go, okay, that works. You said the right words that I wanted a person to say in order for me to accept that. that's not me playing the game. That's me playing you. And so the skill, there's still a skill to the game. The skill of the game goes from being a good role player or being a good character builder. And the skill of the game goes, how well can I emotionally and psychologically manipulate you, Hassel, the game master? Because that is what social encounters are. They are a manipulation of the GM. And so it's still, based off of charisma. It's just based off of the player's charisma, not the player character's charisma. Cybersmith. I am about to DM in the play-by-post, and I'm asking everyone's lores in advance so I can find an opportunity for my players to use them. The struggle is real. Yeah, the lores, man. The lores in Pathfinder 2 are just actually one of my favorite stories, Cybersmith. When we first played Pathfinder 2, very new to the game, and one of our buddies, George, who tends to make kind of, he made a Tengu. Is that the bird? Is that in Pathfinder 2? What's the bird race? Is it Tengu? Tenku? Anyways, he made a Tengu swashbuckler whose name was his character's name was Albert Ross or Albatross. That was the character's name. So, he's that kind of player, right? Someone who's going to just kind of troll the game. Anyways, so the game starts and I'm GMing. It's Fall of Plaguestone. My spoiler alert, but whatever. Actually, if this makes you not play Fall of Plaguestone, great. It's a terrible adventure. Anyways, a character, there's like a mystery about a merchant who's killed. And we're joking because we get into this thing and I'm reading these notes and I was like, look how specific these things are. This thing says, okay, someone can make a check, a society check, or if someone has accounting lore, they can quickly go through the merchant's books and determine what was going on. And of course, my buddy George goes, I have accounting lore. And I go, how the hell do you have accounting lore? He goes, it came with my background. And I'm like, oh my God, this game, like we've literally turned our PCs from these sort of heroic vagabonds, these sort of scoundrels, these wastrels, these anti-heroes, these misunderstood, skilled people to accountants. They are now accountants. Playing a Pathfinder 1 catfolk investigator named Perlock Holmes. All right, that's pretty good. Albert Ross and Perlock Holmes is pretty good. Princess says, my legit first 2nd edition AP started a couple months back, was Fall of Plaguestone, and it has crashed and burned. I believe it. It's not a good adventure. I can't believe it was the first adventure. It's kind of actually disturbing that it's the first adventure. It's just not good. My buddy Rich is in the chat. He says, or you can have a character that beat the impossible DC and neither you or the players have any other idea how to describe it. This is true. There was one time we were playing Temple of Elemental Evil. I've told the story before. Rich's character had a bard who had an insane diplomacy check. And the party had completely offended this druid. I mean, to the utmost way. And he says, well, can I make a diplomacy check? I go, there's no way. He goes, well, listen, I don't know what I would possibly say to this person, but I'm just me. I'm just I'm just a 20-year-old guy, My character, though, is one of the greatest diplomats in the world. Certainly he would have an idea of what was said. And he rolled well, got like a 40 diplomacy check. And I was like, yeah, that does it. And I'm like, he's like, so what happened? What did they say? And me and Rich looked at each other and said, we'll never know. None of us here are good enough or charismatic enough or diplomatic enough to ever know what was said that day. All that we do know is that the person was convinced. Okay, Hassel, I'll buy that. That's a little bit. At least sounds cooler. That sounds like a Keanu Reeves, Denzel Washington movie. Heraldry lore, yeah, baby. It's so funny because, 4th edition, another thing that people had a complaint with 4th edition was 4th edition didn't, like 3rd edition / Pathfinder 1, right? It had the profession skill, which nowadays we would call the lore skill, basically. And it was very much like non-adventuring activities and Yeah, but it gave you this. You had to spend points, and you could put points into disable device or climb, or move silently, or hide in shadows, or arcana. But you could put points into profession accounting, right? If you wanted to. And in 4th edition, they removed that, and they basically say in the book, like, yeah, your character, can be whatever you want. If you want to be an accountant, you can be like. But all that stuff's in the background. It doesn't matter. We don't need rules for it because it doesn't matter. People hated that. People really got mad at 4th edition for that. So there's because there's this idea like, if it's not on my character sheet and if it doesn't have a number next to it, then it's not real. And if it's not real, I can't possibly deal with that. And that is how we end up with the lore skill in Pathfinder 2nd edition. I am going to die. I'm going to die. Aaron Smith from the channel, he had a long stretch of writing characters' names backwards for his character names. So like his most famous character was a dwarf fighter cleric, and the character's name was Rethgif Cyrillic. Cyrillic was the character's name. And yeah, that was AKA Reth is what people called him, but his character's name was cleric fighter backwards. Bardic lore, lore master lore, esoteric lore is definitely a cheat code. The GM could do nothing but bend to my whim. Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't mind that stuff. You can't do crypto in Patreon. Damn, I'm sorry to hear that. So I want to hear. Put in chat. We're gonna go a little bit longer here. What are some of your favorite fighter feats? So I talked about this before. At level 1, I firmly believe that sudden charge is probably the best fighter feat. Double slice is probably the best fighter feat in the game. In fact, I could argue that if you were a fighter and you only took double slice and never took anything else, your character would be probably one of the most effective characters that you can make in Pathfinder 2nd edition. But double slice is incredibly powerful. Obviously, you don't necessarily have to be a dual wielding character. But you also get point blank shot, power attack, reactive shield, snagging strike, sudden charge. These are all really good feats. You like agile grace? You mean agile shield hand or agile shield grip? Is that what you're talking about? Combat assessment actually isn't bad because again, it's letting you get 2 actions for 1. The problem is you're just competing against feats that are just way better than this feat. And again, anything that improves your action economy in this game is pretty great. At level 2, I love combat grab. I think this is one of the coolest feats in the game. Matt Rock, I agree with you actually a lot. I agree with you a lot. I do agree that combat assessment I wish did more. Boothby likes snagging strike. Is this the first? Yeah. Okay. This is like the first hand feat, right? It's like, okay, you're not grappling them yet. You'll grapple them next turn. This is the one that lets you knock them flat footed. And I agree. Like right from the beginning, you're starting to be not only effective damage dealer, but also effective debuffer. I agree. People don't have a lot of love, RPG gamers, for intimidating strike. But when we played Rise of the Runelords, Gore, our buddy Rory, played a fighter, and he used a bastard sword, and he used intimidating strike. And I thought intimidating strike is a great feat. I mean, being able to put this out early is, I think, really, really important and cool. And yeah, I mean, it's 2 actions, but a lot of times, that third action, you're not going to use it anyways. Maybe you lead off with an intimidating strike and then you follow up with a -5 attack. You weren't going to -10 attack anyways. So I actually really like intimidating strike. I agree. It's not like the most powerful, but that's my point. Even a feat that isn't that great, like intimidating strike, is still pretty okay. It's still pretty good. especially because you can crit a lot. I mean, by the time you're level 5 and you get crit specialization plus intimidating strike, like you can do a lot of stuff with a critical hit. It's pretty great. Let's see. Intimidating strike, then combat grab. That's a great kind of wombo combo because combat grab needs you to have press anyways, right? Hassel, I was saying originally, right? Sudden charge. But yeah, I mean, if you're already in melee, you intimidating strike followed up with a combat grab, making it more likely. And because they're frightened, they're going to be less likely to be able to break out of your grab. Fear gem is fantastic. I agree. Absolutely. Is that the one that doesn't let them lower their fear? Tiger Lemur. So yeah, press makes me angry, but I guess it's okay because I'm fighter. That's the idea, I think, of press. The idea is that because the fighter is already 2 points of attack bonus higher, even when they're at their multiple attack penalty, it's really only like a multiple attack penalty of like -3 or -2 if they're using agile compared to what other characters would have. So that's why press is a fighter thing. I will admit that I don't think it's not particularly fun or flavorful. Obviously, in the Pathfinder 2 sense, being able to do something like combat grab, where you get to make an attack, and then if it hits, you have the person grabbed. If you could do that with a map of 0, that would be really, really brutal. Sean, that's why the barbarian feats aren't good, and I don't think the class is that powerful. Yeah, I agree, RPG gamers. Like, because one of the cool things about the fighter is so many of their things work when they hit. Because then you're a fighter and you hit a lot. So it's like it's like doubling down on what you already want to be doing anyways. Another one, which I love, people mention lunge. And yes, this my fighter in my 20th level fighter with the dual flick maces had lunge. Fantastic feat. I also really like, what is the one where you punch him in the face? Knockdown's pretty good. Is it Dazing Blow? Is that the one where you have to have him grabbed? Yeah, this feat's great. This feat's incredible. I love this feat. What a cool way to like build your character, because like if you have like Dazing Blow and combat grab, like you have all this really cool, interesting idea of like, hey, do I want to attack first with no multiple attack penalty and try to get a good attack in, and then follow it up with a combat grab to get them grabbed? Or maybe I start with a grab with my 0 map using an athletics check and then follow up with a Dazing Blow. Like, what am I really trying to go for here? Am I trying to go for more damage, or am I trying to go for more control? Right? Like, I have a bunch of options. Sean, was this 20 level fighter supposed to be a Munchkin build? Yes, Sean. I was like, look, I want to try to see if I can break Pathfinder 2nd edition. And yeah. And yeah. Like, it was it was like, also like, to be clear, like we were fighting like a level 20, I think we fought like a level 26 or 27 monster. So it was pretty, like by the end of it, it had escalated pretty highly. Archetypes that give press make me sad, like combat grab on wrestler. Right. Yeah. Well, another reason why the fighter is just that damn good. Disrupting stance is incredibly powerful. I'm a big fan of that one as well. Reflexive shield is another great one. I mean, that's the other thing too, is like a fighter, it's like, man, you get so many cool options. Like you can pick up all these awesome shield feats, and there's even feats that I think people sleep on. I think blind fight is a really good feat. I mean, you're spoiled for feats. You get your combat flexibility feat. I think blind fight is actually a pretty good. Now, of course, if your GM is only never throws invisible or concealed opponents at you, I think that this is a totally serviceable feat. And the fighters get so many feats because they get those 2 extra bonus feats. I actually think blind fight's actually pretty damn good. Obviously, quick shield block is insane. Agile grace, is this the one that see, here's the thing. I actually don't know if agile grace is worth it, because like going to -3 off of instead of a -4 is not that big of a difference, and your bonus to a hit is already high enough. I mean, I don't know. I guess it really depends on whether or not you're ever making that third attack, because -6 instead of -8 is a big difference. If you're fighting a lot of lower level monsters and you're frequently making 3 attacks in a turn, maybe I can live with Agile Grace, but it's tough for me to sell that one. Combat reflexes is obviously in nuts. This is probably, I mean, is this like a must-have, right? Is this a feat tax? Is there ever going to be a fighter who doesn't take combat reflexes? Maybe a bow fighter. So combat reflexes is damn fine. RPG says, this highlights one of my favorite things about Pathfinder Sectors, the ability to really mechanically build out a character concept as long as the feat support is there. Rain Hunter says, blind fight is definitely not slept at my table. Good. I think it's a great feat. I really do. My fighter took blind fight with combat flexibility, which is a fantastic way to take it. Fought a Medusa on Sunday. I blindfolded myself and missed the DC 5 flat check with blind fight 3 attacks in a row. Oh, that's so brutal. That's so brutal. That's a good point. Agile Grace does stack with some of those press and freehand thingies. Yeah, that's not a good point. That is a good point, Cybersmith. I actually do like that point. And you know what? The end result is these feats are all interesting and they're cool. And yeah, there's a couple of them that aren't like the best feats in the game, but there are so many. Like my fighter had Fearsome Brute because I gained a circumstance bonus to damage rolls is very rare in the game, by the way. There's not a lot of things that give you a circumstance bonus to damage rolls. And because of our fear runes and our fear abilities, like a lot of our monsters were typically, frightened 2 or frightened 3. And we also had like a bard, so their frightened couldn't go below 1 because of the dirge. So like most of the creatures we were fighting were frightened 1 or 2 or sometimes 3, which meant I was doing triple damage. So a frightened 3 opponent, I was getting a +9 circumstance, which is very hard to get in the game. Circumstance bonus to damage. When you combine that with the huge enlarge bonus, which is a status bonus to damage, along with a greater weapon specialization that a fighter gets, right? So you have your strength plus your greater weapon specialization, which is 8. So 7 from your strength at the end of the game. That's 15. Plus 4 points from huge, which is 19. Plus 9 is, plus 28 raw damage. Plus elemental runes. Plus base weapon damage. Striking runes. I mean, it was, and then all of that gets doubled on a crit. I'm just saying, it was pretty damn powerful. Pretty damn powerful. All I'm going to say. Well, your fighter is S tier, Booth B. You just are not S tier. That's a good point too, Rain Hunter. I mean, here's the thing about Agile Grace though. Agile Grace only matters if you're attacking 2 or 3 times a round. If there's ever such, like there were, again, I don't value even in a fighter, I don't value even the second attack that much until I pretty much always have haste. I would much rather move, strike, aid than move, strike, strike. To me, aiding is a better use of my action. Especially if I have someone in the party who can really double down on that. Like if you have a fighter, boy, like get yourself a barbarian or inventor that has a big 2-handed weapon and has power attack or whatever the inventor version of power attack is, or get a magus or, someone who can really, even a rogue, someone who can really benefit from stacking that aid onto a really single powerful attack. Because that is going to be the best way that your fighter is going to be able to support them while also setting them up. So, it's just like, I mean, think about it this way, people. Think about it this way. 3 actions, no haste. Okay. My fighter moves in against an enemy, right? Thank you, Cybersmith. Megaton strike is what I've been trying to say this whole stream. But think about this concept. My fighter goes in with a stride and closes the range to an enemy. Then my fighter uses an attack and they have the best attack bonus in the game. They crit. the person is knocked prone. The person is knocked off balance. They're flat-footed. If I'm using a sword, let's say I'm using hammer currently, they're knocked prone. I have a crushing rune, or I have a greater fearsome rune. They are now -2 status penalty from either being clumsy or from being frightened too. So they're flat-footed, they're clumsy, or they're frightened. I have reduced their armor class by 4 in 2 actions. And I've done damage. I did a critical hit. Third action, I'm going to aid. My rogue buddy's coming up for a sneak attack. Luckily, they don't even have to flank if they don't want to. I mean, they could, but they don't have to. I've made the person flat-footed because they're prone or because they're knocked off balance. My rogue, I'm going to aid them. I'm legend. I'm going to give them +4 to hit. That means that my fighter in one round, repeatable, infinite times per day, gave that rogue by themselves +8 to hit while also doing a shitload of damage and having really high armor class, incredible saves, great perception, really high hit points. It's just such a good class. Like, it's not just doing damage and being boring. Like, you are a combat tactical genius. You are the maestro. You are the conductor of the tactical flow of your group. I'm telling you, it is really an impressive class, and it's a lot of fun to play. Yeah. All right. Good stuff. All right. So we talked about the fighter, about why it is that I think it's one of, if not the greatest or strongest class in the game. Sorcerer probably is the magical equivalent. Sorcerer kind of is a better spellcaster at everybody else's spellcasting game. That +2 bonus is a huge deal. And they're not doing anything about it in remaster. If anything, they're making the fighter stronger because they're getting rid of open, which doesn't matter much. The only time open matters is this scenario. You're in combat, you're fighting against somebody already, you kill that person with your first attack. Cool, they're dead. There's another opponent, maybe on the other side of the battlefield, and you want to sudden charge over to them because it's 2 strides away and still make a second attack, albeit at -5 or -4. You can't do that today because if you have a multiple attack penalty, you cannot use a feat like sudden charge, which has the open trait. But they're getting rid of that. So now, in theory, you could do that. Is that a huge buff? No. Is it a buff? Yeah, it's a buff. You are going to be able to do more than you could before. So they're not changing anything about the numbers or anything like that. Now, they are going to change Hammer Flail, which, to be honest with you, it needs to change. It's too powerful. So, I mean, supposedly. That's what Michael Sayer said. So we'll see. Just before the end, what would it take to bring the barbarian up to the fighter's level without boosting proficiency, in your opinion? Ooh. I mean, the simplest answer is, I think the barbarian, it's tough. I mean, obviously the barbarian did more damage. I think rage doesn't do enough damage. That's part of it. I also think barbarian should do more. I think the barbarian's defensiveness is probably okay. The giant instinct barbarian's pretty rough because they get that clumsy and the rage penalty. So it's 2 points of AC down. That's pretty rough. I think, listen, damage resistance would be a nice thing. I think barbarians should be a little bit more supernatural. I think that they should be, I think the rage should be scarier. I think the rage should be like an option, like a nuclear option. And I think that the barbarian should maybe get to do more like status effects and like, I want I want a thing where it's like whenever the barbarian, drops a foe or crits, like they howl and it's like an AoE demoralize or just an AoE frighten one, like savage cuts and you're like giving people persistent bleeding damage and just like, you're ripping people apart. Like I want the barbarian to feel more visceral. Instead, they just get this kind of very neutered, flat damage bonus, which doesn't feel, number one, it's not, for a lot of the instincts, it's very minimal. the giant instinct obviously is really high, and the dragon instinct is pretty good, but it just doesn't feel good, John didn't miss his chance to choose what the next class is going to be because he dropped his wrench on his phone and shattered it. John, I am so sorry. That sucks. Hopefully you have it insured and or it's old and you were going to get a new one anyways. I hope. That's all right, John. We got the VOD. You can watch it. I'm sorry about your phone, or not if it was a shit phone. So yeah, I think there's a bunch of different ideas about how you can make the barbarian. For me, it's not just about the barbarian being more effective. I think it's honestly about the barbarian being more fun. Like, I don't want the barbarian to just kind of feel like a fighter who also has to spend a round raging. Raging doesn't make me feel like I'm raging, right? That's what I'm kind of getting at. Raging doesn't make me feel like I'm raging. And I think that would make the class a lot more interesting, a lot more fun. It is if there was something mechanically that, and I think that's actually kind of true. I'll give you a great example. This is actually kind of true of a lot of classes in Pathfinder 2. It's actually a critique I would make, is that a lot of the classes don't feel like they're the class that they should be. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an exemption to that. Swashbuckler. The mechanics of the swashbuckler, the need to get panache and rebuild it, and the finishers, and make you play in a way that makes you feel like a swashbuckler. And, your character is going to, somersault into combat and tumble through the legs of the monster and gain panache and then, stab them around and then flip to the other side of them and do a confident finisher. And that gameplay pattern very much supports the sort of fantasy or the idea of the swashbuckler. So I actually don't like the swashbuckler, but I like that class because I do feel like it is creating a play style experience that is very, very what you want out of it. Right, exactly. Swash love, even if it's suboptimal. It is suboptimal, let's be clear. But at least it really, leans into it. So yeah, so like, yeah, like John, it's like, the idea of a person who's good at fighting being a class just isn't good game design. It has no real identity. It's like Goliath being ancestry of big humans. So I will agree to this. If we go all the way back to the beginning of the stream, the fighting man used to just be the fighting man. The other classes were cleric, thief, and magic user. The fighting man was the fighter. They were the one. And let me be clear about this. This was in a game where the thief was not the rogue. The thief was a thief. The mage did not have cantrips that they could spam in combat. Sure, they would eventually get fireballs and magic missiles, but the mage was a spellcaster. That doesn't necessarily mean the same thing if we think about it today in terms of, that means they use spells in combat. No, it didn't. They were a spellcaster. The cleric was a bit of a combatant because they got heavy armor and they got a somewhat favorable attack matrix. But the fighter was the class for combat. If you wanted to enjoy that part of the game and kick ass at that part of the game, you chose to be a fighting man. But as the game changed from Dungeons and Dragons to combat and tactics, and combat became the central point, and the other pillars of the game became a distant second, third, or fourth place, combat became the default assumption of the game, which meant that everybody was balanced to be good at combat, which meant the fighter, like in third edition, had no identity because everybody was supposed to be good at combat. And now the fighter wasn't even that good at combat. So in Pathfinder second edition, they made him the best at combat. But in my personal opinion, so I guess that's something, but also that's a problem because now that is what the game is about. So, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't design. So Roxley says barbarian idea, the more you miss, the more damage your next hit does. Roxley, I like ideas like that. I like I always I'm a devil's advocate for like these type of mechanics. Like I caution people to be to about game mechanics that rewards you or only occur when something that you don't want to have happen happens. Like, yes, missing and dealing more damage is cool because you're going to miss. It's going to happen. But like, I think about this, like the way that like some abilities in Pathfinder 2 say, like, when you're crit, you know, I think the inventor has a bunch of shitty feats like this where it's like, when you're crit, make a DC 18 flat check. And if you succeed, something little bonus happens, which is fine, except you're like, okay, number one, this isn't going to happen that often. And number two, it's weird because it's creating this weird perverse incentive where I've taken something that was only going to come up when I have something happen to me, which I don't want to have happen to me, which is getting crit. And furthermore, the biggest thing is I have no agency in that happening, right? That is my biggest problem with what you just described. Like, I'll give you a great example. A mechanic I love from 5th edition D&D is the Barbarian's Reckless Attack. I think that is awesome because it is a pro-agency move. The Barbarian character can choose to make their attacks with advantage, but then for the next entire combat round, everyone has advantage to attack them. They don't have to use it every turn. They don't have to even, I think, be raging. Maybe they do, but I don't think they do. They can turn it on or off, but you are making a proactive decision about increasing it. So like for me, like a barbarian idea would be like, and this is more pro agency, would be like, hey, you have a thing where it's like, you can increase your damage, but for every, 5 points of damage you increase, your AC penalty increases by another -1, you know, up to some max, maybe depending on what level you are. And so like a barbarian could choose to go all in and really sacrifice their, you know, armor class, but you're at least making that sort of you're making that choice. But a smart group might play around that and say like, oh, if there's a way we could do that, but also protect the barbarian, then that's pretty cool. Cause then we're kind of getting the benefit without paying the price. But getting the benefit without paying the price is, in my personal opinion, something that the game designers of Pathfinder 2 have tried really, really, really hard for that not to be a thing that happens anymore. Now, because back in the day, it used to be like, hey, there's this really powerful thing you could do, but it has this really big downside. But if we can mitigate or eliminate the downside, then it's only upside, right? And so that's sweet. Yeah. So anyways, that's kind of where I think that I mean, yeah, Bloodied was great. I love it. Yeah, John, I don't know that I agree that the fighter is necessarily boring. I don't think that, maybe it's more of just like, I think the other classes have just gotten, I don't think you need a ranger. I don't think you need a swashbuckler. I don't think you need as written, I don't think you need a barbarian. If the barbarian had more of like a primal magic, you know, kind of weird, like that would be sort of more, you know, more appropriate. But I really don't, I think a lot of the quote unquote martial classes are actually the ones that we don't need. I mean, yeah, I also think that classless design is also totally fine and acceptable, John, but that's a topic for another stream. I saw a third-party action called Frustrated Strike. When you're at full map, you can ignore the penalty, but take a -5 to AC until your next turn, something like that. If you didn't hit this turn. I mean, I at least appreciate that. People really need to stop just with the 3 attacks. I mean, I wonder how badly maybe that's the reason why people say this game is hard. I don't know. Like I said, once we got to like level 13, 10, like, I'm not saying it was easier before that, but once we get 10 or 13, the game was pretty much over. Didn't the original Paladin Barbarian as fighter subclasses? They were, Flan. They were fighter subclasses. Ranger was a subclass of fighter as well. And I should note that the Ranger and the Paladin were better than the fighter to, the way you want to describe it. And the reason that was balanced is because the Ranger and the Barbarian and the Paladin, especially the Barbarian required insane amounts of experience points, almost double what the fighter needed in order to level. But outside of that, you also needed insane ability score requirements to even qualify for the class. So the way that the class was balanced was because very rarely did someone actually roll high enough to qualify for it, which is kind of it's balanced and fair, but only if you look at it from a certain perspective. Like, it's balanced in the long term, But like at the moment, if you're the character with the insane paladin who happened to roll, I think you need like a 12 strength and like a 4. Let me look it up here. To be a paladin, you needed to have, here we go. It's insane. You need to have a 12 strength, a 9 constitution, 12 or higher strength, a 9 or higher constitution, a 13 or higher wisdom, and a 17 or higher charisma. And if you could do all of those things, then you could be a paladin, which was busted. It was broken. But the downside of it was, you know, and it was like, oh, but it's balanced. He had to roll really well for those stats. Okay, great. But I'm the one over here playing the generic as fuck boring fighter, and he gets to be, you know, Charlemagne or, you know, King Arthur over here, and I kind of suck, you know. That's true, John. That's also a good point. The original Barbarian was really insane, but it was more, we talked about this on the Barbarian stream, but the original Barbarian was more based off of Conan than it was based off of this idea of this Rager or Berserker. So the Barbarian has changed quite considerably. Thank you for popping in. Good day. Love your work. Thank you. From Australia. Good day. Good day, mate. That's my attempt at being Australian. Yeah. So that is, that's the fighter. You know, it's kind of come a long way. It's kind of had a various, you know, changes as we introduced feats to the game, and 4th edition, it became like a defender, a tank. And now in Pathfinder 2, you know, it's back on top. It is a damage dealing machine that can also be a fantastic tactical leader or resource in your combats between using different builds. I mean, really, you know, take a look at some of those different builds of a fighter, because you're going to find that there's a lot of stuff that they can do. Don't just automatic. I mean, look, if you want to do the most damage, go double slice. It you know, it is really the best. But if you want to go with the one-handed build and have a free hand and do some grapple shenanigans, that's great. The sword and board is also not a bad one. Two-handed fighter is probably one of the weakest options, but you know, if you get a good reach weapon and make attack of opportunity work for you, like, I don't hate that. No longer love our work. Okay, after that accent. Yeah, well, that will happen. Look, I didn't say it was a good accent, okay? Right, Frostjack, you got it exactly right. A ranger is a better two-handed fighter choice. Interesting. Maybe. I guess. Oh, 2-weapon. Okay. That is not true for most of the game, because while twin takedown is only a single action and double slice is 2, in order to use twin takedown, you have to spend an action to hunt your quarry, which already means you've spent 2 actions: 1 to hunt your quarry, and 1 to hunt your prey, and 2 to do the twin takedown and make 2 attacks. So the fighter is making 2 attacks as well, but the ranger is making those attacks. The penalty is lessened, but it's still with a multiple attack penalty. Whereas the fighter can make that attack with 0/0 map. And because the fighter, on top of that, ignoring all of that, the fighter is also 2 points of accuracy higher. So until you get to the very highest levels where I think like the ranger can make it so that they have like a -1 or something penalty to attack. That's the only instance where I can really, and that's at the very highest levels of the game. I do think the ranger needs a lot of work. I think the class is fine, and given the math and the balance of Pathfinder 2, when I say class is bad, I don't mean like it's unplayable. I do think there are some classes that are bad and are unplayable. I think the Oracle is one of those classes. And I think the Witch is pretty bad too. But the Rangers, if it works, it's fine. But I do think it needs a lot of work. So, yeah, picking up Lunge, getting Guizarm, eventually maybe even getting enlarged spells cast on you by your party members. You pick up Disrupting Stance at level 10, or you pick up whatever it's the one that gives you more attacks of opportunity. Combat reflexes. So that's it. What weapons should go with double slice? Well, the answer used to basically be gnome flick maces. Now, and until they change the rules, Like Warhammer is probably pretty. I mean, if you again, knocking people prone is arguably / not arguably the most effective critical specialization. So I would say that the Warhammer is probably your best bet in terms of. I mean, someone might have an advanced weapon that sort of builds up with it, but I mean, I personally think that that's the best. Yeah, they say they haven't officially said that they're going to fix it, but they've hinted that they are going to fix that. But until they do, I would go with anything from the flail or hammer group, which are probably the best. Club is, I'm sorry, not club. Axe is really weak, and I would really avoid axes. Very disappointing in the axe in this version of the game. Sword's not bad, but knocking him off balance is not that bad. Dual whips, if you really don't want to, if you don't really care about doing damage at all, and you don't want to spend the feat on Gnomish Flick Mace, you could go dual whips. That is actually an option if you really want to be more of a control fighter. Falcata is a good option. Oh, listen, Tim, if you remember, Breck from Quest for the Frozen Flame, John, I don't know if you watched that, John, but Quest for the Frozen Flame, I mean, he dual wielded a battle axe and a hatchet because you want an agile weapon ideally in your offhand, because that way you don't get the -2 penalty on that second attack. So you get a true 0/0 attack. Yeah, I mean, it is cool to think about it option, but I like the idea of like a battle axe hatchet build, like where you kind of have like the battle axe is, being held normally, and you kind of almost got the hatchet underslung, right? Like you're holding it up here and the hatchet's like going down that way. So you're kind of fighting with it like that way. I think that'd be kind of cool. I'll be honest with you, Mike. I don't know that much about the fighter as a ranged build. I was John said anime as fuck. Mark, I was exactly thinking Mohican style. I was thinking Last of the Mohicans. I was thinking The Patriot. That was exactly what the movies I was thinking of, but I was not thinking anime as fuck. Always dual wield flick maces, unless you can wield Hatchet Hoff, then wield Hatchet Hoff. That is accurate. But anyways, I don't know that much about fighter range builds. I mean, in theory, I'm not going to. Here's my problem with fighter range builds. My problem with the fighter range build is, in order for a fighter to be good with a range build, you have to invest in dex, which isn't that bad. But a fighter gets heavy armor proficiency. And that means that by having high dex and wearing heavy armor, which you kind of pay for in your class to some degree, you're not getting the full extraction of value out of your class. Now, again, we don't need to all be car-op fucks. But I'm just saying, like, you are paying a price to be in range. And also, too, you get attack of opportunity as like a default thing, which is a big deal in this game when most people don't get it. And so going to a ranged option kind of is giving up on that ability to make attacks of opportunity. So also, I don't think you can, depending on the weapon, I don't think you can flank with if you have a ranged weapon equipped. So it's kind of tough. No. You don't need heavy armor, John. Correct. But you still get the proficiency. And so if you could think about it, each class has a budget of points that they're using to build it up. And the fighter bought heavy armor proficiency. You're paying for that even if you don't use it. Does that make sense? So, I'll be honest with the princess. I do not know a lot about the gunslinger because I hate the class. So, look. I mean, even I will admit the gunslinger's problem is they're like fantastic if they crit, and they just suck if they don't. Yeah, you can flank with unarmed hassle, but if I'm holding a crossbow, I don't think I count as being unarmed. I don't think that's true that a headbutt counts as being unarmed. Maybe it does. I don't think it does, but I don't know. Let's see. You must be wielding melee weapons or be able to make an unarmed attack. It says you have to be able to make an unarmed attack. So, yes, I do think that's funny. If your bow is one-handed, that is pretty funny, because the idea being that, like, you're like, per twang, oh, I got this fist, punch. That is pretty funny. See here. I mean, it does say here you can strike with your fist or another body part. Unarmed attacks lists the statistics of an unarmed attack damage with a fist, although they will usually use the same statistics for attacks made with any other part of your body. There you go. So, arguably, you are always threatening with unarmed attacks. So, there you go. Learn something new today. All right. So, your fighter can make an attack of opportunity when you're wielding a bow by punching or kicking somebody. So, there you go. And be better at doing that than the monk, because it's dexterity and you're a bow and they're finesse, and you have better weapon proficiency. Well, at certain points in the game, when your fighter mass proficiency catches up to whatever your main proficiency is. There you go. Boom. Kick on armed attacks. There you go. Or the aforementioned headbutt. So, yeah, but maybe I don't want Spike Gauntlet. Maybe I'm not that edgy. All right. It's almost 10. Oh, it is. Oh, shit, it's past 10 o'clock. So we went 3 hours. Thank you, everybody. Everybody who came out tonight. We had a huge group here. I want to thank GM Scott for the tipping. I want to thank Sean and Rick for the amazing, incredible tips, and Henry as well for supporting our Root program and show. Thank you for John for coming out with $100, dropping a massive super chat to get us started off with. Thank you so much for that, John. John gets to decide what our next class that we're going to do is. So, John, let us know, or you can drop me a message in the Discord. Big shout out to Cybersmith as well, who's just been steadily super chatting all night long. Those all add up. We appreciate the British pounds in the account. They all count. Next week, well, I don't know what I'm doing Thursday yet, but next week we're going to be doing a stream probably from the studio, but then we're going to be getting going down into Origins. We're going to be driving down to Columbus, me, Bob, Aaron. We're going to be meeting up with some of our patrons. We're going to be meeting up with Steven from Roll for Combat. He's going to be there as well. He's counting on me to show him around. He's never been there. He says he wants to tag along with us, which is great. So yeah, we're going to be doing something from Gen Con. We're Origins. Probably going to try to go live. I mean, I went live from the middle of the fucking ocean, so I hopefully can go live from the middle of Columbus. But we're also gonna be doing some podcasts and getting some recording done, which I think will be a lot of fun. Some video podcasts that we might post when we come back, but maybe I can get it posted that same day. But live streams are best, because then we get to answer your questions and have fun. And, you're going to be able to kick back and enjoy with us, as we're probably relaxing and having some fun times and playing some role-playing games. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Really looking forward to that, especially getting to do it with my buddies and my new friends, my patrons, and some of our, if you're watching this and you're going to be in Columbus, take a look. Just keep an eye out for us. If you see us, come say hi. It'll be awesome. For everybody else, I want to say thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you have not done so. That does help get us a little bit of exposure. If you're interested in, thank you, Cybersmith. If you're interested in Knights of Last Call, check us out at patreon.com/Knights of Last Call. We have several different tiers, accessing our Discord, which is private. Only our patrons are allowed access to that. Our content, our extra bonuses, and most importantly, at our $10 level, you get access to our Northern Reaches Pathfinder 2nd Edition mega game. So if you're really interested in a unique way of playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition in a community aspect, kind of similar to Pathfinder Society, but more like it's an ongoing campaign. It's not like everybody's playing the same adventure. It might be worth checking out. So check us out down there. Otherwise, we'll see you Thursday. Not sure yet what we're going to do. But we'll have some fun for you. Hassle, much better than Pathfinder Society, because Pathfinder Society, number one, has to follow strict rules. Northern Reaches, as the players play, they will change the rules of the game. Like last season, they built all these shrines to Desna and brought her favor down onto the expedition of Northern Reaches, and they changed the rules for how hero points work to the better for everybody in the game. because they brought down the favor of Desnoth. Similarly, 13 players decided to sell their souls to contract devils from hell, which not only gave them additional extra powers over the other players in the game, but also meant that they had to give up several of their lives so that if they died one more time, their character was deleted from the game. But because 13 of them did it, the portal to hell opened and the entire world was almost consumed by a diabolic invasion. All of that, none of this is planned. Like me and my fellow people who run the game, like we don't plan anything. We just administrate. We kind of take what the GMs are doing, what the players are interested in, and we just build off of that. So it's very organic. It's very, community driven, and that what makes it so cool. And of course, if someone goes and kills, Grikthak, the Black Dragon, Grikthak, the Black Dragon is dead. Doesn't respawn in 24 hours or 48 hours for the next group to kill him. There's one chance. And that's it. So it's pretty cool. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking out with me tonight, hanging out with me tonight. And I look forward to seeing you either on Thursday or next time we get together. And it's always been a pleasure. Thank you so much to our patrons, our supporters, our adventurers. Thank you to all of you for being part of this channel. We'll see you next time on Knights of Last Call. Good night, everybody.